The young beauty, dressed in an elegant dress the color of the morning sky, with flawless white skin and noble posture, shuddered when her name, like a gust of wind, rustled in the air, making the heart beat faster, because she was the princess of Iona, whose grace delighted everyone around her. Very close, almost merging with the shadow, stood the killer, whose appearance seemed like a frozen picture from a nightmare, and in his hands he clutched a bloody sword from which the scarlet blood of his last victim, sprawled on the cold stone slabs in a silent farewell to this world, flowed in heavy drops. The young man turned sharply, his snow-white hair fell in careless waves, and his wild, piercing gaze, like the flames of a raging fire, rushed at the girl, fettering her with invisible chains, after which he asked with a threat and hidden interest what she was doing in this place where she clearly did not belong. The beautiful lady, realizing the nightmarish situation she had gotten herself into, felt her breathing become intermittent and her heart squeezed with icy fear, because every thought of hers, piercing her consciousness like a flash of lightning, whispered to her that perhaps her story would end here and now under a merciless gaze. The surprised man in the impeccably tailored suit, in which one could unmistakably recognize an aristocrat, slightly raised an eyebrow and, with a slight note of amazement in his voice, repeated after her that fateful word, "the end," as if tasting it, as if pondering its true meaning. In a voice as cold as a winter wind, the nobleman said that Jonah had seen something that should not have remained in her memory, and now this knowledge had become a sentence for her from which there was no escape, for fate does not forgive those who cross the line of what is permitted. The princess sat on the cold stone floor, clutching the hem of her dress with her fingers, and in her head pulsated a single thought. All she wanted was to change her fate, but now her interlocutor uttered words that meant that she had to be disposed of as an unwanted witness. An hour ago, everything was completely different. A girl from the modern world, unaware of what awaited her, cried out cheerfully, spreading her arms and stretching in her chair after sitting for a long time, feeling how her stiff muscles ached pleasantly after a small movement. She had barely had time to enjoy this short moment of rest when an insistent knock on the door made her jump, and turning back with interest, tearing herself away from the computer screen, she thought about who it could be, but looking through the peephole, she realized that it was just a delivery. The delicious chicken legs and wings, neatly placed in the box, exuded a delicious aroma, filling the room with warm, spicy notes, promising a real gastronomic delight, from which it was difficult to look away without feeling a feeling of hungry anticipation. The girl turned away sharply to hide the treacherous gleam in her eyes, because in front of her lay food that looked so incredibly tasty and tempting that it resembled a real work of art, worthy of admiration, and not just an instant disappearance into the abyss of pleasure. She herself was not just a beauty, but also a talented writer, the author of many novels, whose stories captivated readers with their depth, drama, and rich emotions, penetrating into people's hearts, leaving behind a long, lingering trace of inspiration and reflection. She recently completed her new book, a grim, ruthless, dark fantasy called The Traitor's Tomb, where no one found salvation and every hero sooner or later met their tragic fate, plunging into the abyss of despair, betrayal, and fatal mistakes. With a feeling of deep satisfaction, pride, and slight exhaustion, she reached out her hand to the crispy, golden chicken leg, deciding that this small celebration would be a worthy conclusion to her long journey to the end of a novel that now belonged to the world. The girl smiled happily, anticipating a hearty dinner because she intended to eat the entire box of food alone, enjoying every bite, because hunger had been tormenting her since the morning, and this delicious aroma only increased the desire to quickly satisfy her appetite. But suddenly her body was pierced by a strange sensation, inexplicable, viscous, similar to a slight nausea, from which the world before her eyes seemed to sway, and she, blinking her sleepy eyes, tried to concentrate, but everything around her suddenly began to seem somehow unreal, as if in a protracted, disturbing dream. Puzzled by this incomprehensible state, she slowly rubbed her eyes, hoping that the illusion would disappear, that everything would return to its place, but something inside told her that something inexplicable had just happened, going beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality, as if her consciousness was about to fall into the abyss. The girl closed her eyes again when a sharp, piercing pain squeezed her head, as if cold claws were squeezing her skull, not even allowing her to breathe normally, and the world around her for a moment became shaky, unreal, as if her consciousness was balancing on the edge between reality and nightmare. At that moment, a strange, ominous voice sounded in her head. It sounded quiet, but there was no room for doubt in its intonations. It did not ask, did not persuade, but coldly ordered, demanding that she kill someone, and these words sounded so natural, as if it were an inevitable part of her destiny. The girl froze in absolute shock, her breathing hitched, her heart pounding unevenly, and a shudder ran down her skin as the voice repeated its order, adding with terrifying clarity that after the murder she would have to cut off the victim's head, and the thought made her fingers press into the armrest of the chair. Suddenly, as if an echo of the nightmare happening inside her, the cup of coffee standing on the edge of the table unexpectedly slid down, but, surprisingly, did not break into pieces, but only hit the floor with a dull thud, and the hot drink spread across the parquet, leaving chaotic, disordered patterns. Clutching the chicken leg to herself as if it were the last island of reality, the girl trembled in fear. Her breathing was ragged, and her heart was pounding in her chest, because she could not shake the feeling that someone had sneaked into her house, that something frightening, invisible but clearly sinister was lurking in the darkness. Suddenly, a strange, piercing squeak was heard, so sharp and unpleasant that her ears became blocked, and her consciousness plunged into chaos for a moment, and she, unable to bear it, tightly closed her eyes, trying to fence herself off from this terrible sound that seemed to pierce her through and through, shaking her entire being. But when the fear subsided a little, and she carefully opened her eyes, she saw not her reflection in the monitor screen, not the familiar furnishings of the room, but something completely alien. Her arms were thinner, her hair had turned into flowing golden curls, and red eyes were reflected in the mirror opposite. Now her name was Jonah, and she realized that she was not just different, but that she was inside a book, inside a story that had once been just a figment of her imagination, but had now become her new reality, her new home, her inevitable fate, from which there was no escape. A luxurious interior spread out around her, expensive furniture with exquisite patterns, massive red chairs with velvet upholstery, heavy curtains woven from expensive silk, and all this spoke of only one thing. She was no longer a simple girl from her world, but a character in a story where she no longer dictated the rules. Around her, nobles in luxurious attire crowded, loudly discussing the pressing question that seemed to haunt all the nobility. Who would soon take the throne and become the next emperor, capable of keeping the great empire from splitting and flaring up intrigues? The girl stood silently among the guests, her gaze sliding over their animated faces, and her ears catching snatches of conversations full of gossip and speculation, the nobles vying with each other to share rumors about the future heir, about his possible alliances and enemies, about what kind of ruler he would be and what kind of era he would bring with him. Jonah listened to their voices, and with each passing moment the realization became clearer in her mind. She remembered these lines, these conversations, this tense anticipation, because she herself had once written them in her novel, creating the atmosphere of a high society ball filled with intrigue and hidden intentions. With a sinking heart, she suddenly looked down at her hand and, blinking in shock, realized the truth. Her fingers were thin and refined, her skin was snow white, and her nails were perfectly manicured, and in that moment she realized that she had entered the body of a princess from her own book, becoming part of the story she had once created. The huge mansion, filled with the warm light of numerous chandeliers, revealed all its majestic beauty to her. The velvet night stretched out beyond the high windows, and in the halls a grand ball of aristocrats was taking place, where the fate of the kingdom was decided in invisible but significant conversations. Her thin fingers were clutching at emptiness, although just a moment ago there should have been a fried chicken leg there. Fragrant, crispy, so desirable, but it was no longer there, as if it had never existed in this new world, where even such trifles obeyed their own strange laws. Frustrated, Jonah slowly sank to the floor, her heart clenched with frustration and a little despair. She was hungry, terribly hungry, and the thought that the food couldn't move with her seemed especially unfair, because she so wanted at least the slightest reminder of the old world. Her thin, graceful hands began to tremble as the realization hit her with full force. She had truly been transported to another world, to another reality, where there was no longer the usual comfort, technology, and ordinary life. All of that was left behind, and only the unknown awaited her ahead. She groaned inwardly, asking herself the same agonizing question. How could this have happened? How did she end up inside a world that she herself had invented? After all, it was just a novel, a figment of her imagination, but now it had become her new destiny. The character she entered into was not just anyone, but Princess Iona herself, a refined, beautiful lady with a gentle, mysterious smile, dressed in a luxurious blue dress that flowed softly across the floor, emphasizing her noble origins. As a child, thanks to her dazzling appearance, she was a universal favorite. Aristocrats admired her delicate features, musicians sang of her beauty in ballads, and artists dreamed of capturing her image on their canvases, comparing her to the goddesses of ancient legends. But with age, everything changed. The admiring glances were replaced by sympathetic ones, admiration turned into pity, and now, instead of praise, people only sadly said how lovely she used to be, until that terrible incident happened to her, forever tarnishing her reputation. Then, on the day of the ceremonial reception, a foreign delegation arrived at the palace, and at a luxuriously set table, important politicians discussed fateful issues concerning borders, alliances, and impending conflicts, conducting serious and tense negotiations. But the little princess, being still naive and carefree, did not understand the essence of what was happening at all. She was bored, her thoughts were far from diplomacy, and, hearing in the conversation a word vaguely reminiscent of candy, she decided that they were talking about sweets. Unperturbed, she chewed a piece of scrambled egg, leaned forward, and, beaming at the dignitaries, innocently asked if they had any serious sweets problems in their empire, hoping to start a conversation that she felt must be truly important. Then an awkward silence hung in the air. Everyone froze, stunned by the stupidity of the girl, who with her words had broken the whole serious mood of the reception. The gaze of the nobles and guests instantly turned to her. In their eyes a mixture of surprise and bewilderment was read, as if reality itself could not believe what was happening. The emperor, no matter how hard he tried to hide his embarrassment, could not hide his confusion. He was shocked because he did not expect that the princess, representing his family, would turn out to be such a naive fool who, walking through life, did not even notice that real political intrigues and tragedies were boiling around her. Annoyed and shocked at being trapped in this stupid girl's body, Jonah clenched her teeth and bit her handkerchief, trying to hold back the surge of anger. It was excruciating. Her mind, filled with deep thoughts and experiences, was now trapped in the shell of a naive body. The red ballroom had been magnificent, with massive curtains trimmed with gold threads flowing softly across the window openings and crystal chandeliers shimmering faintly in the dim light, creating a sense of grandeur, but now all of this seemed like just a backdrop to the awkwardness that had overwhelmed her. As soon as Jonah realized what was happening, her reaction was instantaneous. She suddenly covered her mouth with her hand, and a loud, shocked gasp escaped from her chest, which literally echoed throughout the room, reflecting the depth of her shock and the terrible realization of what she had just discovered. According to the plot, the current emperor was doomed to a quick and terrible death, which was to be brought upon him by a traitorous hand, and this moment of tragic completion was already inevitably close, like an ominous turn in the inevitably developing narrative. Jonah, realizing that everything she had ever wanted depended on this decision, without a moment's hesitation, rushed headlong into a run, determined to prevent the emperor's death and therefore to change her own fate, for she could not allow such a tragic outcome. The beauty, sparing no effort, rushed along the long corridors of the palace, her heart pounding with fear and despair. If the current ruler dies, then her life will become nothing, because in this case, there will be nothing left but emptiness and a gloomy future, where her fate will be decided in the hands of others. After her father's death, young Jonah was left alone, without political support, and now everyone who had only recently welcomed her as the heir had their dirty hands outstretched, ready to use her for their own purposes, leaving her without choice and power. After this, Jonah found herself completely alone, imprisoned in a palace engulfed in flames, where tongues of fire mercilessly devoured everything around her, and it was here, among the raging fire and crumbling walls, that she was to meet her tragic end if she did not find a way out. The lady, feeling fear and despair squeeze her heart, began to look around hastily, in a panic, in search of her father's room, hoping that he might still be somewhere nearby. But her searches seemed in vain, because the corridors were becoming more and more unrecognizable with each passing second. Suddenly, her gaze fell upon a massive statue of a maiden that towered near a faded yellow wall, like a silent guardian of this place, and at that moment a guess flashed inside Jonah that this sculpture could be something more than just decoration. Abruptly, driven by desperate hope, she stepped forward, grabbed the cold stone wrist of the statue, and putting into the movement all the strength that was left in her weakened hands, tried to turn it, hoping that this would lead to salvation. Thus, with a quiet creak of old stone, a secret passage hidden in the wall opened, behind which was hidden a long, dark corridor leading into the unknown, and at its very end an old spiral staircase was visible, leading somewhere deep underground. Without wasting time on reflection and without thinking about possible dangers, Jonah took a decisive step forward, ran inside, and at the same moment the door behind her closed with a heavy bang, as if forever cutting her off from the past, leaving only one way. Only forward. After several minutes of careful searching, full of tension and fear, the young girl finally felt a metal switch on the cold wall and, gathering all her determination, pulled it hard, hoping that this would at least clarify the situation a little. The old mechanism creaked, and suddenly the space was filled with soft light, revealing before her eyes a massive wooden door that swung open with a soft click, letting her into a huge library filled with countless bookcases, darkened by time. Feeling a great weakness gripping her fragile body, the lovely princess, moving with difficulty, reached out and grabbed the nearest shelf, trying to catch her breath, but her strength was running out, and every movement became more and more difficult. The lady, clinging to the remnants of her composure with all her might, staggered across the cold floor, taking heavy steps forward, but her body, succumbing to weakness, trembled treacherously, as if responding to the rolling fear that only grew stronger with each passing moment, restricting her movements. Suddenly, her heightened senses caught a strange, barely perceptible scent that wafted through the damp air of the library, and driven by some strange inner impulse, she obediently moved forward, allowing this ominous premonition to lead her straight to what she could not have foreseen. The beauty froze in the doorway, her thin fingers convulsively clutching the wood of the doorframe, but her legs seemed to have grown to the floor, not giving her a chance to take even one step forward, because everything in her screamed that she did not want to see confirmation of the terrible guess. For right in front of her, on the cold marble floor, in a dark red pool of blood, lay the lifeless body of her father, and his face, once full of life, was now forever frozen in a silent expression of pain, and this undeniable fact pressed upon her with unbearable cruelty. Suddenly, cautious footsteps were heard from behind the massive bookcases, and the girl's heart skipped a beat as the realization flashed through her head like a thunderclap in the middle of the night. The killer was still in the room, and now she could be his next victim. The noble lady, barely audibly gasping, shuddered with her whole body when someone unexpectedly addressed her by name, and at that moment the realization that she was far from alone here flashed through her head like a cold wave of fear, causing her heart to beat faster in an anxious rhythm. A powerful male hand, covered in fresh drops of blood, clutched the bloody blade of a sword with frightening calm, and the crimson drops, slowly flowing down the sparkling metal, fell to the floor, like silent witnesses of the horror that had just been committed. Before her stood a beautiful but frightening man, a blonde beauty with burning amber eyes, whose features resembled a masterpiece carved from marble, and whose voice, cold and merciless, sounded like a sentence. Since she had witnessed a murder, now she too had to be disposed of. Seized with horror, the graceful lady in the luxurious dress convulsively retreated backwards, her slender fingers sliding along the smooth floor in a vain attempt to find at least some support, and her breath caught when she realized that standing before her was Duke Bonaparte himself, a man whose name inspired fear. However, the man suddenly froze, staring at her with his mystical golden eyes, and, to the girl's surprise, his face, which a second ago had expressed only determination, suddenly acquired something strange, a barely perceptible shadow of doubt, as if he saw something unexpected in her. Thanks to his rare ability to read minds, the young man managed to unravel the truth in just a few moments, instantly realizing that the beautiful stranger in front of him was not the princess everyone thought she was, but was a completely different person who accidentally ended up in this body. The young man, without wasting a second, easily approached, dropping down right in front of the trembling girl who was sitting on her knees, and looking at her with a piercing, penetrating gaze, asked a question that sounded more like an order. He demanded an answer, wanting to know who she really was. The young man was not just a young aristocrat. He combined rare strength, outstanding intelligence, cold beauty, and most importantly, unlimited power that even most of the senior members of the imperial court could envy. However, behind his dazzling appearance hid a frightening secret, a dark side that almost no one knew about, and an ability that gave him an unprecedented advantage, allowing him to become an archduke at such a young age, overtaking many experienced politicians in power. The girl, realizing the danger, convulsively covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a frightened sigh, because if he really had read her thoughts, then he could now know the truth, which meant that she should under no circumstances reveal her true nature. Moreover, what scared her most of all, this man could not only guess that she was a stranger in this world, but also learn the most terrible truth. She did not just get into this plot by accident, but was its creator, the author of the whole story, into which she was now drawn against her will. Bonaparte, his piercing golden eyes narrowing in surprise, paused for a moment, taking in what he had heard, and then, with a dangerous insistence in his voice, coldly asked what exactly she meant by calling herself the creator of their world, because such words were not just strange, but completely impossible. Jonah, feeling her heart squeeze with fear, turned away convulsively, squeezing her eyes tightly shut, as if hoping that if she didn't see his piercing gaze, the reality around her would simply disappear. But she knew that this would not happen, because the man had already understood everything, had unraveled her secret. The young man, without taking his gaze off her, began to slowly approach, his steps sounding frighteningly even and confident. But before he could take the next step, a piercing cry suddenly rang out, filling the space with great alarm. The next moment, there was loud knocking on the door. The persistent knocks grew louder, sounding demanding, alarming, and behind the door, anxious voices were heard calling for the emperor. Someone was trying to enter inside, clearly alarmed by what was happening in the room. The man, with visible fatigue and cold disdain, began to slowly wipe the scarlet marks from the blade, and then, throwing an icy glance at Iona, rudely said that she was only wasting his precious time, not living up to his expectations or trust. Without giving her a second to process what he had said, he grabbed her wrist sharply, squeezing it so tightly that it seemed like the skin would crack if he held on a little longer, and then, in a firm, no-nonsense voice, he ordered her to immediately help him get back to where they came from, without asking any unnecessary questions. Their footsteps, merging with the silence of the night, echoed loudly along the deserted street as the two of them slowly but confidently left the crime scene, taking with them all sorts of secrets that should not have been revealed under any circumstances. Amidst shrill screams that echoed down the deserted corridor, the pair rushed towards the hidden entrance, and with obvious irritation and contempt, Bonaparte angrily ordered his companion to shut up and not waste his time with stupid questions anymore, as she was only getting in the way of his actions. When the secret door finally opened, all the darkness opened before them, as if absorbing the light, and the dark corridors of the palace, in which terrible secrets were hidden, inaccessible to prying eyes, like an invisible wall separating them from the outside world. The lady, not expecting such a bright light, squinted from the blinding glare and, instinctively covering her face with her hand, noted with surprise that this place was completely different from the passage through which she had entered earlier, and clearly led to some unknown part of the palace. The young man, ignoring her expression of displeasure, confidently placed his hand on her shoulder, stroking it lightly, and with cruel determination said that if she still wanted to stay alive, she would have to follow his instructions, silently obeying, without asking any more questions. The noblewoman, with deep despair and hopelessness in her eyes, nodded quietly, not wanting to meet her death, but despite all her attempts to avoid it, she could only come to terms with the fact that she had no choice, and death was already too close. Together they continued their way through the dark corridors, when suddenly in the distance a piercing cry was heard, filled with horror and alarm, that His Majesty was overwhelmed. And this cry echoed, causing them to stop instantly, succumbing to a general panic. It was the voice of the guards, who, hastily heading towards the princess, loudly and insistently called her, as if trying to warn her of the imminent disaster that was creeping up. And each of their steps echoed along the corridor like an alarming sign, a harbinger of an impending catastrophe. One of the guards, looking completely bewildered, reported that a terrible disaster had occurred, and it had already become known that the emperor was dead, and the entire empire was plunged into shock, and now no one knew how to live on, when the figure of their strict ruler had disappeared. Bonaparte, acting according to a preconceived plan, began to play his part, feigning great shock, as if he himself had not been involved in the death of the emperor, wondering how it could happen that the ruler had passed away so suddenly, as if he had not been the one who had taken it. The girl stood next to him, her gaze fixed on her companion, and she could not hide her admiration for his unsurpassed acting skills, which allowed him to hide all his true intentions and feelings behind an impeccable facade of confidence and calm. This handsome man, who had previously stabbed the former ruler with a cold knife without a shadow of conscience, stood before her with an imperturbable expression, as if his actions did not matter in the slightest, hiding all his true feelings behind a mask of calm. When she asked him if he had seen anything suspicious, the handsome young man remained silent, showing no signs of emotion. His male eyes remained indifferent, and he chose not to answer, as if the question was completely unimportant to him. He then casually waved his hand in front of him, as if brushing off unnecessary questions, and calmly said that he had already spoken with the princess earlier, so he did not see anything strange in what was happening, considering the situation absolutely normal and not requiring further attention. Then, with a cold and confident look, the nobleman cast a threatening glance at her, as if openly hinting that the aristocrat should support his version and silently agree, playing along with him in this complex performance so as not to attract unnecessary attention to herself. The lady remained silent, her thoughts clearly aware that the man was trying to use her as an alibi, and she understood that if she did not agree to his terms, she risked falling into a trap from which it would not be easy to escape, becoming an unwitting accomplice to his cunning plan, into which she had already been drawn. After her silence became the answer, she nodded slightly, as if confirming his words, agreeing with his proposal, knowing that this was the only way to avoid further suspicions and unpleasant consequences in this dangerous game, in which any mistake could cost his life. The guards, having received their instructions, quickly disappeared, heading into the corridors of the palace in search of the killer, their steps disappearing into dark passages where their tracks were lost, swallowed up by a silent shadow, leaving only an uneasy feeling of an approaching threat, as if invisible eyes were watching them tirelessly. The young couple, watching the guards retreat, stood in complete silence, not saying a word, as if frozen in place, realizing that their next step could influence the course of events, and each of their choices was like the final chord in this dangerous game, where they themselves became hostages of their decisions. After this, the young man turned round and, casting a glance at her full of hidden authority and undisguised intent, ordered Jonah to follow him, as if his words were not just a request, but a clear and inevitable order which she could not help but obey, despite her inner resistance. Her feminine steps echoed behind his confident masculine ones, softly sounding on the cold marble floor, creating a sense of harmony and order in this magnificent space, where every sound resonated in the air, filling the hall with tense silence. The magnificent hall before them was decorated with a luxurious chandelier that shimmered with a soft light that cut through the darkness, and heavy window curtains, saturated with flowers, created an atmosphere of comfort, as if reflecting the wealth and luxury of this place, in which every element was thought out to the smallest detail. The noblewoman held a cup of tea in her hands, her fingers trembling as she flinched at the words about being called too playful, and felt a cold shiver run down her spine, because such words were not just a remark to her, but a caustic jab into the very soul. Bonaparte sat opposite her, his arms folded across his chest, his gaze stern and uncompromising, as if trying to understand who she really was, penetrating deeper into her essence with each passing moment, as if trying to crack her hidden secrets and weaknesses. Jonah hesitated, her nerves giving way to the tension, and she began to fidget with her hands, trying to control the excitement that was evident on her face, although she tried to hide her emotions behind an outward calm, which was becoming increasingly difficult to do. There was food on the table and a kettle nearby, creating a cozy atmosphere despite the tension in the air, and it all seemed like a strange contrast as Jonah struggled with her inner turmoil, her thoughts racing in search of a solution, restlessly sliding from one memory to another. Bonaparte asked sternly that if he were a character in a new novella, it would turn out that the entire world around him would also be fictional, like a carefully created plot, where every action and event is controlled, and where there is no place for chance, and everything that happens is just a figment of someone's imagination. Uncertainly, the beauty agreed with his words, but she could not find suitable explanations, how all this could be explained or justified, because her mind was filled with doubts, and she could not say exactly what was really happening, confusing reality with fiction as in the most confusing dream. The lady did not know how to react, because everything that was happening seemed so absurd, and she herself, having found herself in this novel completely by accident, was confused, completely lost, and not understanding how she ended up here and how to get out of this absurd situation. In her mind, she was sitting on her knees, tormenting herself with thoughts and desperately holding her head, feeling how horror and confusion overwhelmed her, as if the whole world around her was turned upside down, and her only desire was to break out of this book, where everything that was happening seemed alien and strange, like a scene from a strange dream. Almost crying, she yearned for simple things like chicken legs, which in her memories were incredibly appetizing, and she dreamed of returning to her world, where food and ordinary life seemed so real and understandable, so warm and homely, filling her inner world with comfort and peace. Bonaparte continued the conversation, waving his hand, as if to show that he didn't care about her doubts and worries, and calmly spoke about his future, as if he already knew that their lives were not just a random story, but part of a well-thought-out plot, where he was just a character. The noblewoman awkwardly looked away, feeling her heart squeezed with helplessness and uncertainty, and fell silent, not knowing what to answer because there were too many questions in her head, and there was neither time nor confidence to resolve them, and she could not find the words to express her fears and worries. According to the plot, Bonaparte was supposed to die. His heart suddenly stopped beating as the course of events predicted, but at that moment something went wrong, and she, with horror realizing that everything was not going according to plan, felt fear grip her. She immediately shuddered, covering her mouth with her hands in an attempt to hide her confusion and disarray, unable to contain her excitement because she kept forgetting that her companion, as an experienced manipulator, could read her thoughts and was able to see her inner experiences. The man, frozen on the sofa, motionless, concentrated, and then finally ordered her to tell him everything in great detail, as if his life depended on every word, and now she had to tell him everything she knew, exposing her role in this incredible, dangerous plot. The guy's face was stern, full of determination and cold persistence. His eyes did not leave her, and he wanted to know his entire story, from the very first steps, right up to the last moment, and each of her answers became the key to the riddle that he was so desperately looking for. In the book, after the tragic death of the emperor, a prince was to ascend the throne, a blonde youth dressed in a bright red cloak who, thanks to his exceptional appearance and impeccable charisma, immediately won the respect of everyone who met him. Bonaparte, not missing the chance, took advantage of the moment and, having seized power, began to manipulate the new king. Like a puppeteer controls his toy, forcing him to make decisions that were beneficial to him, while he himself controlled every step, thereby strengthening his influence and promoting his hidden goals. However, one day, when the emperor finally learned that it was the duke who caused the death of his family, the flames of rage engulfed his heart, and the desire for revenge became his main driving force, determining all his further actions, because revenge was now the only meaning of life for him. The beauty froze awkwardly when she suddenly realized that she did not remember what was supposed to happen next according to the main plot, and despite her confidence in control of the situation, her memory refused her, leaving her in deep confusion, which led to a feeling of complete loss of direction. The man, noticing her confusion, did not hesitate and, looking at her decisively, with an insistent and even slightly threatening tone, asked how she could not remember what she herself had written, questioning her, as if she should have known every detail of her own story perfectly. The lady shuddered, her hand involuntarily reaching to her face, trying to hide the nervous movement, while her heart beat anxiously, and sweat appeared on her forehead, emphasizing her confusion and tension in this dangerous situation, as if she already felt the approach of trouble. Just as she was trying to come to her senses, a cold blade suddenly flashed in front of her, pointing straight at her, with such a threat that the air around her became thick, as if the danger itself was hanging in the moment, ready to fall upon her. The man's hand, tightly gripping the hilt, confidently held the cold blade, and the guy, with a ruthless expression on his face, declared that she was undoubtedly guilty of creating this world, that her mistakes led to the disaster, and even if she killed him, it would not change everything that had been done. His gaze was full of determination and menace, the cold confidence in it left no room for doubt, and the man was determined to finish her off, because he was sure that she was responsible for everything that happened and must pay for it. Bonaparte stated that he had kept her alive because he believed it could be useful if she could only figure out how to save him from death, but now that she had not done so, he was beginning to doubt whether it made sense to continue keeping her alive if she could not help. A frightened Jonah screamed that she would definitely remember everything if she was given at least a little time, because she was sure that her memory would return, and only then she would be able to find a way to help and fix everything that went wrong in this difficult situation. The pair walked away, clutching their hands to their chests, and quietly whispered that they would definitely remember everything, because their memory, despite the confusion, would still return, and those pieces of memories that had slipped away could be decisive in their difficult future. Bonaparte froze when he heard these words, and, immersed in complex thoughts, he realized that there might be some truth in her words, that her help could be decisive, and even if he was not sure of her powers, he began to feel that her role could be very important. After these words, Bonaparte put away his blade and, holding back his irritation, asked how much time she still needed to remember everything, because he was already beginning to lose patience and did not understand how long she would hesitate and what else could prevent her from regaining her memory. The lady breathed a sigh of relief, but soon the handsome Bonaparte said that he could not trust her completely, and this was a painful blow because she hoped that her efforts would finally be appreciated, but in his eyes there remained only a shadow of doubt and mistrust. A man's hand placed the documents on the table, and a voice, completely without any emotion, ordered the princess to sign, as if there was no other choice but to comply with his demands, and he was impatiently waiting for her to do so without the slightest hesitation. The girl asked what kind of documents these were, and in response she heard another order to sign them, and, feeling growing uneasiness and great anxiety, she obediently reached for the pen, fearing that any mistake or delay could turn against her in the worst case. After which the noblewoman handed the signed papers back to the man, trying to remain calm, although inside she was tossing and turning with anxiety and worry about what she had just signed, not knowing all the consequences of her actions and what awaited her next. Bonaparte, taking the documents, also put his signature, and then, carefully looking over the lines with his eyes, as if finding some hidden meaning in them, thoughtfully remained silent, giving no sign that he was thinking about what had just happened. It was only when the princess breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that everything was finally over, that the man spoke, saying that there was a marriage contract in front of her, and now they were officially a bride and groom, which made her heart clench in surprise and bewilderment. In shock and complete confusion, the young beauty froze, not expecting such a turn of events, her eyes filled with surprise, and she could not believe what had just happened, feeling how the world turned upside down in an instant, not knowing what to do next. The dear lady jumped to her feet, her hands pounded the table in rage, and she, unable to contain her emotions, screamed, demanding an explanation of what Bonaparte meant by his words, which so unexpectedly destroyed her entire peace and tranquility. The man's finger pointed upward with determination, and without showing the slightest sympathy, Bonaparte, coldly and without emotion, informed her that she was given exactly 1 month, no more, to prove her usefulness, otherwise she would pay for it with her life. After this, Bonaparte, without hiding his determination, in a stern and ruthless tone, declared that if the beauty did not demonstrate her value in this short time, and did not justify his high expectations, then her fate would be decided, and she would die, becoming nothing more than a useless object. Jonah, who was standing by the table, looked up with a frightened and confused look on her face, her hands still touching the surface helplessly, and her eyes filled with complete confusion and horror as she tried to understand what this man really meant. The fear and uncertainty that rolled down her face made her freeze in place, unable to understand how to properly react to this cruel and completely unpredictable reality that was imposed on her without any compromise, like a merciless sentence with which she would have to live. The maids helped the lady dress with great care and attention, carefully combed her long hair, and carefully applied nourishing cream to her face so that her skin would look fresh and her hair would become silky and manageable, in keeping with her high status. The maiden, feeling deeply troubled and confused, turned away with a heavy heart as her thoughts involuntarily returned to what she was about to do, and every glance at the preparations for the coming event only increased her anxiety and worsened her well-being. The girl's golden curls gradually unraveled, her long strands flowed softly down, creating an impression of lightness and tenderness, but at the same time there remained sadness and wariness on her face, which did not disappear, despite the care of the maids and their diligent work. Suddenly, when the comb ran too hard through her long hair, the girl screamed loudly from unexpected pain, and her face immediately distorted from discomfort, despite the efforts of those around her, trying to make everything as neat as possible. The maid, blushing with shame, quietly apologized to the princess for her mistake, trying to justify her actions, hoping that her apology would be accepted, but there was still concern in her voice, the realization that she could have done much better. However, the woman's hand continued to squeeze the golden strands tightly, causing pain, and despite all efforts to help, each firm grip of the hair only increased the discomfort, making the princess feel how the unpleasant sensations increase with each movement. Another maid roughly massaged the lady's gentle hands, trying to relax her, but only making the situation worse as she squeezed her palms too hard, causing inconvenience and discomfort, not noticing that the princess only felt irritation from her actions. When the maids had finally finished their work, they silently took their things and quietly left the room, not daring to even look at the lady, who continued to sit in silence, watching them with an expression of displeasure and fatigue on her young face. The girls bowed to their mistress before leaving her presence, and despite their attempts to hide their feelings, they bowed to her, their movements cold and mechanical, as if they were already tired of her company, feeling a hidden irritation. Jonah jumped at the loud and unexpected noise as the door slammed shut behind the girls, leaving her in complete silence, lost in her thoughts, feeling like everything that was happening had become empty and unnecessary to her, meaningless to those around her. The noblewoman was truly angry with the attitude of the servants because they behaved with her so arrogantly and rudely, as if she were a nobody, an insignificant person, not deserving any respect or even the slightest attention from everyone around her. This was the case in this novel. Poor Jonah, due to her naivety and inexperience, was completely ignored by all the servants, who treated her as if her existence did not matter at all and she was just a helpless figure. With a heavy sigh, the lovely Jonah glanced into the huge mirror, trying to examine herself, as if hoping that it would be able to reflect not only her appearance, but also the feelings that were seething like a storm inside, echoing in the fragile female heart. She had magnificent, large red eyes, like juicy apples, which could not help but attract attention. Bright and alluring, they seemed to radiate all that passion and mystery that is so difficult to hide from prying eyes, remaining undisclosed secrets in them. In the mirror reflection, Jonah saw herself, a stunning blonde princess with flawless snow-white skin, long eyelashes, and a look that simultaneously radiated tenderness and hidden melancholy, as if deep experiences and unexpressed worries were hidden in it. For a moment the girl froze, completely absorbed in the process of getting used to her new appearance, peering into her reflection with such concentration that it seemed she could feel how her perception of the world was changing, because now she had become a completely different person. Jonah tried to calm herself down, thinking that maybe it was all just a dream, that she had actually just fallen asleep in normal reality and was now in a strange, frightening nightmare that she hoped would soon end and she would return to her normal life. Soon the lady, feeling tired, went to her bed, raised her legs and lay down on the soft sheets, hoping to at least rest a little, immersed in silence and forgetting about the disturbing thoughts that tormented her soul in recent days. Placing her hand on her forehead, Jonah exhaled heavily, her thoughts again returning to that strange voice that not long ago ordered her to kill someone, but who exactly was the object of this order, she still could not understand, and this scared her. A new morning had arrived, and through the high windows of the majestic castle, a soft light was shining into the spacious courtyard, illuminating everything around, and the blue sky, without a single cloud, gave clarity and a feeling of freedom, despite the anxious atmosphere that hung within the walls of the castle. Jonah found herself in the armory, a huge room where numerous sharp spears lay on the shelves, sparkling like diamond rays, ready for battle, and in the corners stood shields and other weapons that suddenly became a part of her life, and all this filled the space with inexplicable tension. A noise was heard from the corner of the room, which echoed throughout the entire room, when one of the girls, seized with horror, tried to figure out what was happening in this beautiful place, where there were so many weapons, and why they were collected in the princess's room. Jonah was in complete shock, trying to comprehend that there were now so many weapons around her bed, as if they were preparing for an attack, and she couldn't understand how all this connected to her life, and why her room was now turned into something completely alien. Before she had time to fully recover from what was happening, she suddenly heard the door open, and her brother entered the room, who, not noticing the tense atmosphere, wished her good morning with sincere interest, plunging Jonah into even greater confusion. Her cute younger brother with blue eyes and golden hair asked his sister not to worry, saying that he had contacted a priest who would come soon and sort everything out, so she could not worry about the future, not being afraid of anything, calm down because everything will be fine. Jonah sighed heavily when she realized who was standing in front of her, because it was the prince, and now the king, the man she once shared so much with. But everything had changed, and now their worlds had become so distant, alien and almost unrecognizable, like strangers. It was her dear younger brother, named Armand, who always loved his sister, treasured her and respected her opinion, and for him she was the most important thing. And despite his age, he was always ready to support her in any situation, not counting the difficulties, even if everything did not go according to plan. The girl coughed sharply, trying to hide her embarrassment and reminding herself that she needed to play the role of a naive fool, so as not to give away her true mood and reaction, which she carefully hid inside herself, not showing weakness and holding herself confidently. But then Armand, with a heavy expression on his face, uttered the words that touched her heart so painfully. He said that their father had died the night before. The man's voice was full of loss, and the girl felt how hard it was for him to talk about it, because he himself could not believe what had happened. The lady smiled in surprise and, deciding to play her role of a naive fool, curiously asked what exactly the word died meant, as if she could not understand what was being discussed, which only emphasized her diligent playfulness at this moment. The man, with a heavy sigh, explained that it meant the death of their dear father, who had been killed by some unknown killer, and his bad words hung in the air like an insurmountable weight, so that they contained both regret and despair at what had happened. The girl, without changing her facial expression and continuing to smile, as if not understanding that her brother was talking about a tragedy, continued to play her role as if nothing had happened, hiding all those feelings that raged in her soul under the mask of carelessness. The brother took his sister's hand in his own, painfully, with anxiety in his eyes, and said that he was very worried about her, because her well-being was the most important thing to him, and this great anxiety did not leave him for a minute. Anxiety squeezed his heart, making him worry. Armand sat down by her bed, looking at her with pain in his soul, and quietly said that she was the only thing he had left, his dear little sister, and despite all the trials and losses, he could not afford to lose her, for she was the meaning of life for him. When his relative accepted his help, the young man felt relieved and, with a slight smile, asked her to be patient with her illness for a little while, but added that it was necessary to strengthen her peace and security, since it was his duty to protect her so that she would feel safe and at peace. After this, young Armand stood up and, smiling, said that if necessary, he would order his servants to prepare breakfast for her, because it was important to him that she felt care and attention, even in such difficult and dangerous moments for both of them. The girl, having said goodbye to her dear brother, smiled at him, trying to hide behind her bright and sincere smile the anxiety that did not leave her heart, because she was perfectly aware that ahead of them there were not only joyful moments, but also inevitable trials that they would have to cope with. The prince, walking confidently away, took a few steps. His steps were quiet and determined, but suddenly, as if something in his soul made him stop, he slowed down, and stopping abruptly, turned his back to her, as if he felt that something remained unsaid. Afterwards, with his back to her, he said that he knew that she had spent time with the Duke yesterday. His voice was serious and his words were weighty, and there was anxiety in them, as if he had a premonition of something, and his words echoed in her heart, causing a strange uneasiness. Jonah, smiling but with obvious tension in her voice, responded with forced joy that yes, they had indeed met and just talked, but her words could not hide the fact that she was nervous, sensing hidden meanings in these words. Armand, noticing her anxiety, abruptly changed his calm and confident tone to a more agitated one, warning that Bonaparte was far from the man he claimed to be, and strongly advised her to stay away from him in order to avoid unnecessary risks, after which the door slammed loudly behind the young prince, who walked away quickly, leaving behind a heavy shadow, as if his departure was not just a moment of farewell, but something more important, leaving an emptiness in the air and feelings that she could not ignore. Awkwardly, but with obvious anxiety, the beauty sat down on the bed and thought, horrified at the thought of how angry her brother would be if he ever found out about her engagement, which seemed like such a secret that she had to hide and not reveal to anyone. However, she was well aware that she was completely confused in this situation and could not choose what was more important to her, to follow her heart, or to think about how much her brother loved his sister and how this could affect their relationship if the truth ever came out. The lady was having tea on the veranda, where a table and chairs were comfortably arranged, and behind her stood servants ready to help if she needed anything, creating an atmosphere of calm and peace, although her thoughts were far from this peace and quiet, completely absorbed in anxiety. Tired, the girl leaned on her hands, folded in front of her, and, lost in thought, tried to understand what she should do next, what decision she needed to take in the situation, which seemed to be getting more complicated with each passing moment. The blue sky, strewn with light clouds that glided smoothly across the boundless vault, seemed so peaceful and beautiful that for a moment she forgot about all her worries and experiences. However, reality soon overtook her again, and she realized that her life could change dramatically. Suddenly, feeling her emotions overwhelm her, she clenched her fists in front of her and, not holding back her despair, shouted loudly that she would survive at any cost, despite all the difficulties, and that, despite everything that was happening around her, she was not going to give up, finding within herself the strength to fight for her freedom. The lovely Jonah started as the Duke suddenly appeared before her, his presence so sudden and unexpected that she had no time to prepare herself for the way he extended his hand to her with grace and confidence, inviting her to further communication. His hand was dangerously close, just a few centimeters away from hers, and his fingers barely touched, which gave her a strange feeling, as if invisible energy was being transmitted through this barely noticeable contact, leaving an unpleasant feeling of tension. After that, with a slight grace, the young man kissed her hand, as if emphasizing the importance of the moment, and then, stepping back slightly, with genuine interest, asked if it was normal that she returned to her room so late yesterday. His voice sounded with a note of care and concern, making Jonah think. The princess felt her body break out in a light sweat, and everything inside her was shaking, as if her nervous system could not cope with such an unexpected close contact and manifestation of attention. And despite the desire to respond, she could not find words which spoke of deep embarrassment and fear. The Duke then turned to the maids, asking them to leave the room, stating that he needed to speak with the lady alone, and with a slight, almost imperceptible gesture pointed to the door, expressing a desire to be alone with the lady for a more personal and frank conversation. The maids, not hiding their great curiosity, left, whispering among themselves, confident that soon the whole palace would be full of rumors about what had happened behind closed doors, and their whispers filled the air with mystery, anticipation, and possible consequences. Trying to keep her cool and not show her emotions, the girl, slightly bowing her head, asked in a restrained voice what brought him here, trying to hide in her voice the anxiety that was growing in her heart and the uncertainty that overwhelmed her, standing before him all alone. The man, sensing her tension, changed his tone to a rougher and more decisive one, holding back all the emotions that were on the edge, and replied that he had come for the same reason for which he had stood before her earlier, as if he were returning to the same unresolved matters that were of great importance to both of them. Bonaparte replied sullenly that he did not like the rumors that claimed that he had married a princess called a fool, and with obvious dissatisfaction he ordered the lady to stop behaving so stupidly, adding that she should have realized long ago the seriousness of what was happening. The girl, holding back a wave of anxiety and inner restlessness, began to play with her hands on the table, as if trying to find consolation, and, with a slight smile on her lips, replied that she would gladly agree to the request, but she understood that her brother would begin to suspect her, which would inevitably lead to dangerous consequences. Horrified and with a heavy heart, the lady realized with horror that the man was not only going to kill her brother, but also to force her to relive all these tragic events, depriving her of any hope for a peaceful future and safety, which left her in a state of fear and helplessness. The guy, with obvious surprise and bewilderment, fell silent, his face changed. He did not expect that the girl would show such care and affection for her brother, which made him look at her from a different side, unraveling her hidden feelings, which she so carefully tried to hide. After which, with a gentle and sinister expression on his face, he began to gently stroke her cheek, as if trying to assert his power and authority over her fate, saying that anyone who dared to stand in his way would certainly die, which sounded like a threat, but there was a shadow of something deeper in his voice. Then, leaning towards her, he gave her a command with a slight, almost imperceptible contempt, asking her to smile, because they were already being watched from hidden places, and the gaze on their actions was not only alien, but also full of hidden interest, which added tension to their communication. Swallowing with excitement, young Jonah, with a hint of wariness and slight fear, stretched a languid but sweet smile on her face, trying not to give away her true feelings and tension, but her heart was beating wildly from what was happening around her. and then, trying to hide her real feelings, she made a reserved and calm face, and then, with a slight laugh, continued to play her role, hoping that her external calm and confidence would be able to convince everyone who was watching her that she really was not experiencing internal unrest. Mentally, standing in front of the Duke and feeling the full weight of the moment, Jonah called him different words, scolding him for his coldness and cruelty because each of his actions caused her more and more disgust. But she remained calm and only for a moment allowed herself to free herself from this whole mask. Then suddenly the man's hand suddenly reached forward as if in a sign of powerful attraction, approaching her face, and his gesture became so sharp and confident that Jonah felt her heart beat faster with anxiety and worry. And the Duke, with a cold determination in his voice and a confident look, firmly declared that he would announce their engagement in a week, immediately after the burial of the former emperor was completed, as if everything had already been decided and the time for any discussion had long passed, leaving only his will and plan. Surprised, confused, and completely overwhelmed by what was happening, Jonah barely had time to realize that he was going to do everything so quickly that even the sweat from her face barely had time to run down, and, squeezing the internal tension, she realized that she could not allow herself to lose control, despite the storm of feelings raging inside her heart. The Duke, without giving her time to think, reminded her that she had only a month to prove to him that she was truly useful to him, otherwise she risked facing consequences that could turn into a tragedy for her if she did not want to accept this game. The blue sky, serene and clear, with clouds floating across the firmament and butterflies fluttering around, creating a wonderful contrasting calm that seemed so far removed from the tension that reigned in Jonah's soul, as if everything around was in complete peace and she was the only one who carried the storm within herself. The young lady sat outside drinking tea again. Each day seemed almost identical to the previous one, and everything around was monotonous, as if time stretched out into infinity, absorbing her thoughts and feelings into a boring and mundane reality. She was very bored, leaning her face on her hand, thinking about what to do with this life, because existence at the court of a handsome prince seemed to her completely devoid of meaning, filled only with indifference and routine from which there was no way out. The woman's hand, with a slight movement, reached out and took the light cup of tea. The woman's fingers trembled slightly, as if trying to find at least the slightest consolation in this simple action, which it seemed could become her only source of peace in this world. Then suddenly, at the most unexpected moment, Jonah choked and spat out all the tea in front of her, as if her body had suddenly become alien, not subject to her will, and she realized that she had lost control of the situation, forgetting about all her thoughts and the world around her at the moment when everything went wrong, as she expected. The maid, who stood nearby with a grin and slight contempt on her face, apologized and said with feigned kindness that apparently she had confused sugar with salt, as if this were the most natural explanation for such a flagrant incident, which could hardly leave Jonah indifferent. The maids were not afraid of the princess's wrath, and therefore it seemed that for them she was only an object for constant teasing and ridicule. They did not take her seriously and, it seemed, enjoyed her weakness, forgetting about their position in this society. Just recently, instead of warm water, they poured cold water into her bath, and young Jonah was unable to wash herself properly. Her entire attempt to find at least a little comfort in this place was ruined by the cruel actions of those who were supposed to care for women's well-being. The lady could hardly contain her real anger, which raged inside her, and could hardly imagine how in the future she would take revenge on them all for these humiliations, when her patience would run out, and the strength and opportunity for revenge would be on her side, and then she would not spare them. Suddenly her attention was drawn to the strange behavior of the gardeners, who were especially busy today, sitting near the bushes and doing something in them, and she could not understand what exactly they were hiding, because it was obviously something important, and she could not help but feel suspicious. At this point, the maid, noticing the princess's interest, came closer and asked with slight curiosity if she had seen anything unusual or strange in the actions of the gardeners. Although the maid herself did not know anything, but there was alarm in her tone, as if she suspected something. The tea, carefully poured into a porcelain cup, swayed quietly on the saucer, creating an atmosphere of comfort and tranquility. But for Iona herself, it was a moment filled with anxiety, because she knew that the calm was only an illusion, hiding the coming storm and danger. Jonah listened with interest to the rumors that a delegation from the Vatican would soon arrive to visit the deceased emperor and express their condolences, feeling how every piece of news about the upcoming event, even if it concerned death, still tugged at her heart. The maids, noticing her attention, suddenly began to laugh, not hiding their mockery, saying that the noblewoman had not appeared in society for a long time, and thus they continued to point out to their own pleasure her isolation and loneliness, which, in their opinion, only increased with each passing day. Silently, the beautiful lady, not wanting to show her irritation, concentrated on the reflection of her face in the cup of tea, which seemed strangely alien to her, as if a strange face was looking at her with this expression of worry, which plunged her even more into thought. Suddenly, without saying a word, Jonah stood up, abruptly putting her cup down on the table, and walked away, trying not to pay attention to her recent actions and the maid's question, to which she calmly replied that she simply wanted to take a walk, hiding her true thoughts. She ignored the maid's chatter about how the princess was a nuisance to everyone in the palace, causing nothing but trouble, and continued on her way, deciding in her heart that none of their ridicule would stop her in her search for what she was meant to understand and find. In front of the Duke stood a servant who, despite the tense atmosphere in the office, continued to calmly report that the criminal who had committed the murder of the emperor had never been found, while the nobleman himself, deep in work, sat at his desk, absorbed in business. Bonaparte scratched his face thoughtfully, as if trying to rid himself of the obsessive thoughts that were haunting him. His gaze focused on the emptiness in front of him, and his fingers unconsciously slid over his tired face, reflecting the internal struggle. When his assistant suggested taking a short break and taking a little rest from the intense work, the Duke firmly refused, explaining that he now had many things that required his attention, and that rest at such a moment was absolutely impossible for him. The sweet boy standing next to him fell silent, not knowing how to properly express his thoughts and what to say to the master, because there were rumors that he was in love with the lovely princess, which became the cause of a lot of gossip and complicated the man's position. Clutching the papers in his hands, the adult nobleman spoke first, recalling how rumors began to spread about his relationship with the princess, as well as the sister of the new emperor, raising a wave of speculation and fears that all this could undermine his reputation. After a few moments of reflection, Bonaparte suddenly understood what the young servant had meant when he spoke of rumors, and his face dimmed a little with the realization that all this harassment and gossip was not as far from the truth as he would have preferred to admit. The young man standing in front of him did not know how to respond properly, and, absorbed in his thoughts, he thought that the rumor that his handsome and arrogant master was dating a stupid princess was not something to be taken seriously, since it was just a common abuse of rumors. The Duke, noticing the servant's brief confusion, chuckled discreetly, and again concentrated on his documents, as if nothing had happened, his gaze remaining cold and focused on more important matters that could not be delayed. The servant, slightly startled by surprise and embarrassment, looked at his master with slight surprise, but, not having received any additional instructions, again felt his attention being diverted from the conversation and continued his work without keeping unnecessary thoughts in his head. The servant, holding back his displeasure and embarrassment, bowed quickly, but thinking to himself, he wondered with surprise what kind of person his master was, so unpredictable and strange that his actions were difficult to understand. Bonaparte, being a man whose intuition was sharp and precise, easily read the servant's thoughts, but despite this he remained silent, not giving an answer even when he was called not the most flattering words, preferring to remain calm and keep the situation under control. His hand tapped his fingers thoughtfully and silently on the table, creating a soft but insistent sound that seemed to be part of his thoughts, reflecting his calm and confidence that he could cope with any difficulties, even the most unexpected ones. The young man could not believe all the words that his new bride said, unable to understand what was reality and what was just a terrible dream, because everything that was happening seemed so absurd and unexpected to him that he was completely confused. Suddenly, unable to restrain himself, he turned sharply to the window, and a man's languid gaze instantly rushed in that direction, as if something important had caught his attention, making him forget about everything happening around him, and his eyes began to record every detail behind the glass. Through the window he noticed the princess walking through the garden with several maids, but it was unclear where she was heading, because her steps did not lead to any obvious destination, and everything around was filled with an atmosphere of mystery and unpredictability. The young man, looking at this picture, gloomily noted to himself how sad and sorrowful it was to observe that the ladies, despite all their beauty and high position, completely neglected even such trifles as the attention of their maids, which seemed completely absurd. The beauty approached the fence, and, absorbed by its mysterious charm, she felt an extraordinary atmosphere forming around her. It was so quiet and cozy here, as if this corner had become her personal refuge, in which she could hide from the noise of the outside world. And so, at that moment, her attention was drawn to the cries of the maids, who hastily reported that the deuce had most likely come closer, and the water in the pond was now unusually transparent and clean, as if inviting her to come and take a look. And she, without hesitation, turned her gaze, but immediately felt something was wrong. Unable to hide her suspicion, Jonah, realizing that the servants were once again plotting something dark against her, as if in passing, began to realize that she had once again fallen into a trap, and that their behavior was far from as harmless as they tried to show, creating the appearance of innocence. And despite her inner uneasiness, she, playing the role of a naive fool, came a little closer and looked where the maid pointed, as if believing that there really was a secret hidden before her, waiting to be revealed, and that there really could be something interesting in the water, like a fish. As soon as the maid stepped on the princess's foot without noticing, young Jonah felt a sharp pain that instantly pierced her, causing her to bend over in pain, and she barely stayed on her feet, trying not to show her fear of what was happening. After a maid accidentally stepped on the princess's foot, Jonah lost her balance, and her footrest tripped, causing her to fall loudly into the water, engulfed by the cold surface of the pond, as she found herself completely submerged in its icy embrace. The beautiful girl could no longer stay afloat. Her body was tired, and her strength was leaving her with every new movement, and despite all her efforts, she sank deeper and deeper into the cold embrace of the water, as if the elements themselves had decided to take her into their dark depths. The maids watched in horror as their mistress did not surface and showed no signs of life. Anxiety gripped their hearts, and they began to hastily talk, deciding that they should immediately call the knights for help, otherwise everything could end in a terrible tragedy. Suddenly, at the very moment of despair, a hand quickly emerged from the transparent water, as if in response to their panic fear. It broke through the dark thickness of the water, and a deafening splash was heard in the air, which filled everything around with glitter and bright splashes. The young maids screamed in panic. One of them staggered in fear and almost lost her balance, because something so unexpected and frightening happened before their eyes that they could not even comprehend what had happened and what they should do now. The lady emerged from the water. Her movements seemed to be planned in advance, without causing the slightest emotion. She walked silently, not paying attention to the shouts of the servants, as if everything that was happening was an empty sound for her, and her steps were confident, like those of a person who was in complete control of the situation. The maid hurried to hand the lady dry towels, trying to protect her from a possible cold, although, despite her concern, she herself was the one who, with a playful intention, pushed the princess into the water, hoping for an easy game, but now felt awkward about what she had done. The towels she handed over were stiff and coated with a dull film, as if they had not been washed for a long time, their grimy fabric indicating that they had experienced many moments like this and were now just a reminder of difficult memories. However, Jonah, with icy calm and unfailing dignity, refused the offered towels, and with obvious irritation said that the maid should use them on herself, since it was she who was wet, and therefore deserved the same attention as the princess. After this, the princess, overcome with anger, roughly grabbed the rag and, with obvious irritation, began to wipe the maid's face with it, as if in this way she was trying to express all her dissatisfaction, while every movement was full of contempt and cold rage. The servants, frightened by such an unexpected act, recoiled in shock, their eyes filled with fear and confusion, and the air itself seemed to thicken with tension, and only now the princess realized that there was clearly something wrong with the towel, and this led to her anxiety. As she looked around, her gaze fell on the lost ring. It was gone, as if all her confidence had disappeared, and the princess realized that the ring the Duke had given her had sunk under the water while she was swimming, and now the responsibility lay with the maids who had failed to keep an eye on it. In a dry, icy tone, full of imperious severity, the aristocrat ordered the maid to immediately go down into the lake and find the lost ring, demanding immediate discipline and impeccable work from her, realizing that it was her duty, and she must do everything possible to return the valuable jewelry. With a wide grin, Jonah looked at the maids with disdain and said with obvious sarcasm that if they were the ones who pushed her into the water, then now, perhaps, they themselves can swim in search of the lost ring, teasing them with her ruthless wit. The maids' gaze froze in horror, and with each passing moment their faces grew paler with fear, realizing that their mistress was absolutely right. They had not kept an eye on the ring, without thinking about the consequences, and now they had to correct their mistake by plunging into the cold waters of the lake. The sunset, painting the sky in deep shades of red and orange, was quietly flaring up over the castle, illuminating its walls and towers, as if nature itself was trying to eclipse the darkness that was enveloping the hearts of the maids, creating a contrast between the beauty and the fear that reigned within. The lady, oblivious to what was happening around her, walked forward along the stone road, leaving wet traces of water behind her. Her dress was soaked through, and each step became heavier, as if the fabric itself was trying to stop her. But Jonah was not going to stop. Jonah, shivering with cold, felt the evening air penetrate her wet clothes, and her body became increasingly cold and numb. But despite this, she continued to walk, not paying attention to her uncomfortable position and wet clothes, already fully aware that the night was coming faster than she expected. Behind her, from the window in the shadow of the dark walls of the castle, Bonaparte was watching. His gaze was cold, lifeless, and sinister. He stood with his arms folded across his chest, showing no emotion, like a stone statue, but there was still some dark power hidden in his gaze. The girl's mood dropped sharply when she noticed this scoundrel standing there in the window. His presence became a real test for her, and she thought that if this man was here, then nothing good awaited her in the near future. He was exactly what she was missing. Slowly lowering her head, she felt her heart become heavy, and her thoughts, like dark clouds, began to thicken, creating an atmosphere of melancholy and sadness around her, because everything that surrounded her seemed so alien and unfriendly. The charming Duke continued to look at her. His gaze was attentive and persistent. He was clearly intrigued by this unusual princess, in whom he saw something that caught his interest, even if outwardly he did not show the slightest sign of emotion. The servant, walking heavily along the corridor with a folder of documents under his arm, moved forward with concentration, mentally going over the importance of the upcoming report that was to be presented to the master, and knew that he had to act carefully because his reputation depended on it. He knocked on the door, opened it, and having calmly announced that the report was ready, stood waiting for the gentleman's reaction. His voice sounded calm, but the internal tension was felt, because his further work and his future in this house depended on how the gentleman perceived him. When the boy entered the room, his gaze caught the figure of the gentleman, who, instead of sitting at the table and doing business, was standing by the window, thoughtfully looking into the distance, which immediately stunned the servant, since he did not expect to see Bonaparte in such a relaxed state. His surprise only increased when he noticed that Bonaparte was smiling, his gaze directed into space, as if he was thinking about something important and profound, and this was so unexpected that the servant did not know how to react correctly to such a rarity. The servant, standing in the doorway in complete confusion, could not believe his eyes, because he had never seen the master with such a smile on his face, and this moment was so strange and unusual that his state of shock was completely understandable. The faithful servant, with undisguised curiosity, glanced attentively behind his master's back, trying to discern what had so strongly attracted his attention, and in the hope of understanding what exactly had made him stop in deep and concentrated thought. Outside the high arched window, which looked directly into the inner courtyard of the majestic castle, a young princess walked leisurely. Her light movements were full of grace, and her posture radiated such nobility that it seemed that nature itself was frozen before her enchanting grandeur. The Duke, whose face had suddenly darkened with an expression of obvious irritation, cast a cold, piercing glance at the servant, making it clear that he was unbearably angry at the impudence of the servant who had dared to interrupt his contemplation of such a fascinating and captivating spectacle. The servant quickly looked away, feeling a slight tremor in her chest, because now she had no doubt that all the palace rumors were true. Her master really was madly in love with the beautiful and unattainable princess. After which, stumbling over every word, the boy began to say with noticeable excitement that he had brought a list of all the nobles and influential people who had been officially invited to the funeral ceremony dedicated to the farewell to the emperor. After this, the man's hand, moving slowly and confidently, extended the folder to the man standing in front of him, and then his calm but firm voice announced that among those invited to this mournful event there was also a cardinal, which could have special significance. The Duke, bowing his head and frowning, took the papers in his hands and with visible thoughtfulness began to read the official documents, carefully analyzing every word, and it seemed sensing that they contained something much more important than it seemed at first glance. The documents spoke of a cardinal whose name was mentioned among those invited, and then the servant, not daring to voice his guess directly, nevertheless dared to suggest that it was precisely that terrible incident, which was whispered about in narrow circles, that became the reason for the summons of this aristocrat to participate in the investigation of the murder. The man and his servant stood opposite each other, exchanging tense glances, and between them on a massive table lay documents laid out, each of which could change the course of upcoming events, influencing decisions on which the future of the palace and the entire empire depended. The man's name was Hajin, and he was not only the current cardinal but also the leading contender for the Holy See, which made him one of the most influential figures in the church hierarchy, and therefore his every action attracted the attention of the nobility and clergy. Recently, cases of children disappearing without a trace have become more frequent in the capital, especially those who were left without families and living on the streets, and alarming rumors about mysterious abductions have spread faster and faster, causing growing concern among the common people. It was for this reason that the Duke, not wanting to sow panic among the townspeople, gave his loyal knights clear orders to conduct a secret investigation, without attracting unnecessary attention in order to find out the truth and prevent further disappearances. The corridors of the mansion were drowned in enormous semi-darkness, massive ancient tapestries were visible on the walls, and scarlet curtains made of heavy brocade flowed at the high windows, letting through only the meager rays of the setting sun, which is why an ominous and oppressive atmosphere reigned in the hall. Bonaparte sighed heavily, allowing himself a moment of irritated silence, and then, clenching his fists, sharply called the guards useless incompetents who, despite all their efforts, were still unable to find out a single important detail about the mysterious disappearances. And so the cardinal was soon officially informed of the situation that had arisen, and without a moment's hesitation he personally took up the investigation of the missing children, deciding that such a matter required a thorough investigation and his direct intervention. Pointing a thin but firm finger at the document in front of him, he ordered in a cold and uncompromising voice that the delegation be placed away from the church and away from the forest lands, stating that it would be safer that way, leaving no room for objection. The servant suddenly gave a violent start, stepped back, and suddenly cried out in surprise when they realized that the Duke, whose plans no one knew about, was soon going to announce his imminent big engagement, which threw them into real shock. After which the man, still not believing what he had heard, sharply raised his voice, and with undisguised indignation asked his master what this unexpected engagement was, with whom he was going to link his fate, and why he had made such a hasty decision. Bonaparte, with cold determination and a clear note of irritation in his voice, firmly and without hesitation, stated that he had long ago made a final decision and intended to marry the princess, regardless of anyone's opinion, possible objections from those close to him, or political intrigues. The servants were dumbfounded, unable to believe what they had heard, and imagining their master next to Jonah, they experienced a real shock, because the thought of the two of them together seemed something completely impossible, frightening, and even partly unnatural. A loud cry, full of genuine amazement and inner confusion, echoed through the spacious halls of the majestic mansion, bouncing off the high walls, penetrating every crack and drowning in the echoing, heavy silence that hung in the air after such an unexpected statement. A serene, endless blue sky stretched above the palace, fluffy clouds floated lazily, and behind the massive windows of the mansion, thick green foliage swayed, rhythmically swaying in the light gusts of wind, as if nature itself had a premonition of the coming changes and was lying in wait. Jonah lay on her soft bed, coughing weakly, feeling an unpleasant ache throughout her body. The consequences of yesterday's incident made themselves known, depriving her of strength and turning every movement into an excruciating ordeal, leaving only a lingering feeling of weakness and increasing fatigue. The silence of the room was broken by the cautious sound of footsteps, and soon one of the maids entered silently, bowed respectfully, and, maintaining impeccable politeness, cautiously inquired about her health, hoping to hear at least a slight hint of improvement or an answer that inspired hope. However, Jonah stubbornly remained silent, gloomily thinking that it was the maids who were to blame for her illness, because it was their doing. Yesterday's incident, when she, albeit as a joke, was still pushed into the cold water, which now turned into a real punishment for her. Slowly, with each movement, as if with great effort, Jonah swung her legs over the edge of the bed, almost wincing from the sharp cold of the floor, after which, with difficulty and unhurriedly, she began to put them into soft, warm slippers, hoping to at least warm up a little and feel relief. Through her irritation and hidden anger, her voice was firm and decisive, brooking no argument, as she gave the maid an order, informing her that she no longer wished to see her former servant in the house, and demanded that she be rid of her presence immediately. The maid, awaiting further instructions, accepted the order, but suddenly, breaking the silence from behind the door, as if in response to an unknown event, footsteps were heard, which echoed along the corridor, disturbing the peace and creating an alarming tension in the air. The girls, confused and with a slight tremor in their chests, noticed how anxiety hung in the air when they heard someone's loud cry that penetrated their hearts, making them stop for a moment, feeling all the unknown threat and anxiety. It was Armand who, unable to contain his excitement, burst into the chambers of his elder sister, shouting her name, and his face reflected deep concern, as if the anxiety that had seized him did not allow him to keep his emotions under control, realizing the seriousness of what was happening. The man approached his relative, his face expressing complete anxiety, and he asked with obvious excitement whether she really intended to marry the evil duke, having no clear idea of the consequences of such a decision, which worried him greatly. After this, young Jonah, with a look of determination on her face, ordered her maid to leave the room, as she intended to speak with her brother alone, without strangers, to discuss everything that she could not say in the presence of others. The girl tried to change the subject, justifying herself by saying that she was simply worried about her brother's health, advising him to rest more and not overexert himself, hoping that in this way she would distract his attention from more serious issues concerning her future. The prince said with obvious disappointment that he was very worried about his own sister and that she should under no circumstances marry the duke, because this decision could entail many undesirable consequences that she did not yet suspect. Awkwardly adjusting her hair, the beauty raised her hand and, with slight embarrassment on her face, began to justify herself, feeling how her words literally dissolved into thin air, because she understood perfectly well that even the most compelling arguments were not able to dispel her brother's concerns. According to the young man, the Duke was not just an unpleasant person. He was cunning, mean, and two-faced, hiding his true nature behind a mask of nobility, which made him even more dangerous and unpredictable in his actions, capable of destroying lives. He had a dark side, carefully hidden from all other people, but to those who knew how to look behind the facade, it was obvious. This side was full of evil intentions, manipulations, and hidden motives that could destroy more than one life that stood in its way. And it was clear that this young, handsome man was clearly striving for imperial power, dreaming of a golden crown sprinkled with blood, ready to walk over corpses without hesitation to achieve his goal, stopping at nothing and no one, because his ambitions knew no bounds. The Duke was not just a deceiver, he was a traitor and a renegade, willing to betray those closest to him for his own gain, and his actions left no doubt as to his true intentions, which were full of cruelty and calculation. Jonah stood opposite her brother, listening attentively to his words, but unable to bear any longer his persistent anxiety, which she considered unreasonable, interrupted him, declaring that it was time to stop this talk and give her the opportunity to make her own decision. Armand continued to insistently explain that the young sister should have no connection with the Duke, convincing her that he was not only a liar, but also a cunning deceiver, carefully hiding his true intentions behind a mask of kind nobility. The lady, tightly clutching the fabric of her dress, with a determined expression on her face, said that she had already signed a contract with the nobleman, ignoring her brother's protests, as if she was absolutely confident in her decision, and had no intention of deviating from the intended path. The prince, hearing these words, froze. Overcome with shock, his gaze became empty and confused, and for a moment he could not believe that his sister had already agreed to marry the evil Duke, despite all his warnings and attempts to convince her otherwise. Jonah immediately objected, confidently stating that Bonaparte had not insisted that she sign the marriage contract, as if trying to justify his actions, hiding the true intentions and circumstances that forced her to make this difficult and possibly wrong decision. The young man, unable to understand how she could voluntarily agree to marry such a disgusting man, looked at her with complete bewilderment, unable to comprehend how his sister could fall into this trap without seeing the full depth of the true threat hidden behind the mask of nobility. The beauty, hearing her brother's words, froze in bewilderment, not knowing how to react correctly when he announced that he intended to immediately go and talk to the Duke, deciding to intervene and, perhaps, stop her from taking an irreversible step that could lead to disaster. The lady ran in a hurry after the handsome Armand, trying to stop him, but her steps were too slow, and she could not contain her anxiety because her heart was increasingly seized by the fear that her brother would not have time to prevent the disaster that was approaching. Her quick steps echoed and her white shoes slammed loudly on the floor, a warning that time was running out and she could not afford to hesitate, for every moment brought them closer to an inevitable collision with a terrible fate that could not be avoided. The maid, walking anxiously, followed the prince like a shadow, unable to stop despite all her anxiety, for she understood that nothing she said could stop him from his determination to go and meet the Duke in order to stop the catastrophe. Armand was filled with rage, his teeth clenched and his gaze full of determination, because he was sure that Bonaparte had deceived his sister and forced her to agree to this marriage, and now he could not just ignore all this, knowing what a threat this man had become. The blue eyes of the charming prince were full of determination, his gaze was hard as stone, and he could not allow his sister to become a victim of this evil Duke, because he was ready to do everything to prevent her from falling into his trap, despite all the difficulties. The man slammed the door shut, a sound like thunder cutting through the silence as he entered the other nobleman's chambers, seemingly unaware of how much his presence was now disrupting the calm and tranquility of the room, creating a tense atmosphere. Bonaparte, with various papers in his hands, was reading with concentration, without raising his eyes, but when he heard the prince's steps, he quietly asked with what intention he had come, not hiding a hint of light irony in his voice, as if he knew in advance that the visit would not be peaceful. Young Armand, without hesitation, firmly stated that the Duke should explain his actions and justify his actions, because his decisions and actions not only threatened the honor of their families, but also brought dangerous discord into the relations between all the nobles. The nobleman, feeling uncomfortable, held his gaze, looked away slightly, as if trying to hide from the prince's directness and persistence, and regretfully said that he did not understand at all what was being discussed, making excuses and hoping that all this was just a misunderstanding. The stern man suggested that the royal person go to the living room where they could discuss all the issues, but Armand, without hesitation, firmly stated that they would talk right here and now, without any delay, since the time for discussion had already been lost. The handsome duke's golden eyes glittered like wild predators ready to attack, and his gaze was filled with a hidden threat, as if he was trying to figure out how far the prince was willing to go in his courage before it dried up and gave way to nothing but fear. The prince, with complete calm and determination, declared that his interlocutor must immediately cancel the wedding with his sister, otherwise the consequences would be unpredictable, and there was such confidence in his words that it was impossible to doubt the seriousness of his intentions. The young man bore responsibility from an early age, realizing that in the future he would become an emperor, and even then he realized the full gravity of his position. Despite his young age, his life was filled with responsibilities, strict expectations, and serious decisions. The young boy looked up in surprise when he was addressed in a gentle voice, and his face lit up with a warm smile for a moment, because he knew that only she could speak to him in such a way as if she did not notice his future responsibilities and pressures. It was his sweet older sister who always took care of him, supported him despite her own worries and responsibilities, and suggested that they go out and play, forgetting all the heavy responsibilities, to spend a little time with him without thinking about the future. She joyfully and skillfully wove beautiful wreaths from flowers of rose groves, as if each of her creations was imbued not only with tenderness and love, but also with a special warmth that sincerely brought a feeling of carefree and pure moments of their happy childhood. Then Jonah, with a warm and caring smile, looked at her little brother and tenderly said how beautiful the wreath looked on his head, as if her words filled the air not only with a soft light, but also with love, which always warmed his fragile heart. The boy nodded sheepishly, feeling the new crown on his head, and deep down he promised himself that he would always protect his sister, because her support and care meant the most to him, and he was willing to give everything to keep her completely safe. The prince's voice was unyielding as he firmly told the duke that he must immediately cancel the marriage with his dear sister. His words sounded like an order that did not tolerate the slightest hesitation or attempt to avoid the consequences, for he was not going to back down. The young man slammed his hands down on the table and turned back to the duke with determination, his gaze full of intense determination, as if he was ready to make every effort and use any means to achieve what he considered absolutely necessary to achieve his goal. Stubbornly, Bonaparte waved his hand towards the door and insistently suggested that the royal person go to another room, where they could calmly discuss all the important issues over a cup of tea, to relax a little and continue the conversation in a calmer atmosphere. Armand instantly froze in place, his body tensed, and his gaze became wary. He clearly felt that the cunning duke was planning something evil, and this alarming guess pierced his mind like the blade of a dagger hidden behind the back of a treacherous conspirator. Turning away abruptly, he said in a cold, harsh voice that there was absolutely no need for tea, adding so much harshness to his intonation that even the air in the room seemed to tremble with an unexpected outburst of irritation, as if he had not simply refused but cut off any opportunity for argument. Bonaparte, with his head casually inclined, glanced over his shoulder, his golden eyes flashing in the semi-darkness, and a sly grin playing on his lips. An expression that was at once mockery, arrogance, and an elusive shadow of dangerous, wolfish predatoriness. A magnificent crystal chandelier, strewn with sparkling pendants, hovered under the ceiling of the hall, casting reflections of luxury on the richly decorated walls, which danced in the semi-darkness, creating the illusion of living, pulsating light, giving the entire space a solemn, fairy tale atmosphere. As soon as Armand sank down onto the soft cushions of the sofa, his gaze became heavy and piercing, and his voice became decisive, without a shadow of a doubt, and without wasting a second, he directly asked the main question, Why Bonaparte so categorically refused to dissolve this marriage with his sister? Lady Jonah was pure, innocent, like the morning light that touches the silk on the mountaintops, and the very fact that she was used as a pawn in someone else's insidious plans was disgusting and humiliating, because in this dirty game, her honor, dignity, and fate itself turned out to be a soulless bargaining chip. The Duke, without changing his relaxed, almost mocking pose, folded his arms across his chest and, squinting, asked whether the prince had really acted on the princess's will, to which he, without a moment's hesitation, coldly and confidently replied that no, it had been solely his own initiative. But no matter how Armand tried to prevent this union, he was too late, because their wedding had already been sealed with a marriage contract, and even though he was burning with indignation and despair, the seal on this document silently testified to the fact that his sister's fate had long been decided. Everything was legalized. The young man jerked impulsively, ready to jump up from his seat and declare that the marriage could still be dissolved. But before he could utter a word, Bonaparte lazily but confidently raised his hand, stopping his impulse, and in a cold, imperturbable tone said that this was strictly his personal business with the princess. The man, without changing his stern expression, slightly bowed his head and chuckled with a clear note of superiority in his voice, after which he declared that the prince in their couple was just a third wheel, an unnecessary observer, who had neither the power nor the right to decide anything, because this union was not concluded for his approval. Armand froze in place, his lips trembled, his mouth remained slightly open, but not a single sound escaped his tongue, because he could not find a single compelling argument to object to, and the Duke's icy calm knocked any possible arguments out of his hands, turning them into useless scraps of thoughts. His fist convulsively clenched the fabric at the bottom of his cloak, and his mind raced in futile attempts to figure out what really motivated Bonaparte, and the deeper he tried to get to the truth, the more he was lost in conjecture, because the Duke's true motives remained hidden behind a mask of indifference. An open book lay on the table, its pages slightly fluttering from a barely perceptible draft, and next to it stood a cup of cold tea, left unfinished as if someone, lost in thought, had forgotten about it, bogged down in a series of thoughts that were too complex and contradictory. It was really hard to believe in the sincerity of the feelings that were attributed to the Duke and the princess, because they only occasionally crossed paths, their conversations were rare and restrained, and now, when they suddenly started talking about their marriage, it seemed something strange, fictitious, far-fetched. Closing his eyes, Bonaparte exhaled, then lazily and almost indifferently said that feelings between a man and a woman can flare up as suddenly and swiftly as a fire, which at first is warm and cozy, and then turns into a raging flame, devouring everything around, leaving only ashes and smoke. Remembering their first meeting, he caught himself thinking that the truth about the princess that he learned then turned out to be much more significant than any romantic games, because she was not just a woman, she was a creator, the creator of their world, the one who once gave this world form and meaning. And finally, Bonaparte confessed that all the rumors and guesses were not without truth, because he really needed the princess not for the sake of intrigue, not for the sake of power or profit, but for reasons that no man could fully comprehend, since they went far beyond ordinary human feelings. The prince clenched his teeth, his breathing became ragged, heavy breaths broke through his compressed lips, and cold sweat ran down his face in thin streams, despite the coolness in the room, because the Duke's words sounded with an unshakable confidence in which there was no falsehood, and from this realization everything inside him contracted. Unable to bear the silence, the Duke rose abruptly to his feet. His movement was swift but dignified. He glanced indifferently at the prince's face, and, without changing his even, calm tone, said that it was time for him to go, since there was much work ahead, and to organize the emperor's funeral. He paused for a moment, and then added as if by chance that, having finished his preparations, he intended to visit his bride, for duty obliged him to be near her, and the importance of this union left no room for delay, and there was not a drop of hesitation or a hint of doubt in his voice. Silently, clenching his fists so hard that his knuckles turned white, the young man sat with his gaze downcast, his hands shaking with anger, and his nails digging into his skin, but he did not utter a word, because he understood that any objection, any word would be meaningless now, because everything had already been decided, and he was powerless to change anything. The prince cowered on the hard sofa, his head down, as if the weight of his own impotence had fallen on his shoulders, and at that moment he clearly realized that he had lost this fight, that the duke had proven stronger, more cunning, more ruthless, and now his sister, his dear sister, had been irrevocably taken from him. On the crimson velvet upholstery of the chair, like a symbol of lost greatness, lay a crown, its shine dimmed in the semi-darkness of the room, and this silent image spoke more than any words. Power, pride, status, all this meant nothing if he could not protect the person dearest to him. The young man covered his face with trembling fingers, hiding his stifled, ragged sighs, realizing that, despite his title, he was a teenager, weak and helpless, without the strength or power to protect the sister he had promised to protect, and this realization burned him from the inside, tearing his soul apart. The night spread through the mansion with the silver light of the moon, which glided along the marble columns, clung to the exquisite tapestries, cast long shadows across the parquet, filling the space with a strange, enchanting silence. But even this beauty could not calm those whose thoughts were overwhelmed by anxiety. The girl paced back and forth in her room in irritation, her footsteps sounding hollow on the carpet, and her heart pounded with worry for her brother. Because in a world where the emperor had just been killed, nothing could guarantee the prince's safety, and the thought that the killer could come for him next soon pierced her mind. The maid, noticing the anxiety and worry reflected on the princess's face, suddenly turned to her with a respectful offer to prepare a hot bath for her, as if hoping that the warm water would help the mistress relax and at least briefly distract herself from heavy thoughts. But as soon as these words escaped the maid's lips, a recent memory surfaced in Jonah's mind. The same maid, the same palace walls, and her own body, suddenly collapsing into the cold water after a cleverly placed trip, accompanied by a stifled laugh. The noblewoman crossed her arms irritably over her chest, narrowed her eyes, and, without hiding her displeasure, sharply asked how the search for her missing ring, given to her by her father, was progressing, to which the maid immediately hesitated, shifted from foot to foot, then lowered her head and began to make vague excuses. But the beautiful Jonah had already understood everything. The search was stopped, no one was looking for her thing anymore, and these people who dared to come to her empty-handed did not care at all how important this ring was to her, and this insolence outraged her to the depths of her soul. And suddenly, before she had time to express her indignation, a distinct, insistent knock was heard in the silence of the room, causing her to freeze. Her fingers trembled slightly, her gaze slid towards the door, and for a moment she was overcome by indecision. She did not know who could be on the threshold at such a late hour. When the massive door swung open with a slight creak, a tall blond man appeared on the threshold, his stately figure casting a long shadow on the marble floor. It was none other than the Duke. His dazzling smile resembled a predatory grin, and sparks of either mockery or interest danced in his eyes. With a wide grin he stepped forward, slightly bowing his head, and without losing his defiantly self-confident tone, greeted the princess, calling her by his name and adding the word bride with special emphasis, as if savoring it, as if checking how it would sound in the air. Jonah raised an eyebrow in confusion, her lips twitched into a strained, forced smile, and her voice was even but curious as she asked what had brought him to her at such a late hour, what business was so important that it couldn't wait until the morning. But the Duke, as if anticipating her reaction, merely chuckled, took a couple of steps around the room, and, casually looking around, began to speak with the same lazy but tenacious interest, saying that there were rumors going around the castle that the princess had dropped a ring in the lake, and, funny as it may be, they were talking about the very piece of jewelry he had given her. Bonaparte, determined to keep up the game as if the ring really existed, bowed his head and with a sincere expression poured out his pity, declaring that something had been lost, and this left a deep feeling of regret that was difficult to hide and forget. The maids shuddered violently when they were confronted with the terrible accusation that they had looked after the princess so poorly that they had failed to notice her in danger, and were now in serious danger for their carelessness and negligence in their work. They stood frozen, trembling with great fear, as the Duke issued an edict demanding that the maids be removed from sight at once, and with every word of his order there was a merciless determination to punish all those responsible for their negligence and short-sightedness in this important matter. Jonah raised her hand, and awkwardly trying to express her opinion, gently retorted that she thought young Bonaparte was overdoing it. But before she could finish her sentence, her fiancé interrupted her again, not giving her a chance to express her point of view seriously, leaving her completely bewildered. Without thinking twice, the nobleman took the woman's hand in his, as if deciding not to leave her alone, and placed a new ruby ring on her finger, which sparkled in the light as a symbol of their relationship, adding to this moment not only an expression of love, but also a solemn gesture. The beauty stared in amazement at her hand and the new piece of jewelry that the Duke had so generously given her, feeling how the symbol of love and devotion contained in this ring filled her fragile heart with surprise, touched by excitement and a feeling of great warmth. The young man was not at all embarrassed. Like a true friend, he approached the princess with a confident and calm look, took her hand and, bending down, kissed it, expressing his respect and reverence, making this gesture not only a sign of politeness, but also of the deep admiration that he felt for her. With a sly grin on his face, as if wanting to tease, he asked her not to take off the ring anymore, so that she would not accidentally lose it twice, which sounded like a request full of light playfulness, but with an invisible threat, giving the words additional meaning and some seriousness. After that, the man bowed and left, leaving Iona alone in the room, shaking with shock, as if everything that was happening was too fast and inexplicable for her, and the feelings that he caused did not leave her, leaving a strange feeling of uncertainty and anxiety. Jonah took a deep breath, trying to catch her breath and calm down, collecting her thoughts, because what had just happened required a lot of effort from her to understand what exactly she felt, what awaited her next, and how she should act in such a difficult situation. The blue sky, the soft green shadow of the leaves, and the first light of a new day, all this seemed especially bright and alive to Iona, as if the world around her was waking up, and she herself could not understand how she should move on in this changed world, where every step was full of uncertainty. The noblewoman stood awkwardly as an unexpected guest entered her chambers at such an early and unusually quiet hour, and immediately began a formal introduction, as if this moment had been planned in advance and expected for a specific purpose, leaving no room for doubt. A whole crowd of new servants appeared before Jonah. All of them, without a single word, bowed their heads before her in deep respect, as if realizing their role, which now consisted of unconditional submission to her will, without giving her time to think or ask questions. Dripping with cold sweat and feeling the tension growing with each passing second, Jonah asked one of the maids with obvious concern who exactly had sent or hired these people, trying to understand what was hidden behind their appearance and what significance this unexpectedly important visit carried. The girl, who introduced herself as Dorothy, stated with clear certainty that she and the others had been sent by the Duke himself, who had entrusted them to serve the princess, giving the whole thing an even greater gravity that Jonah could not help but notice with growing concern. Jonah froze, her hair standing on end in shock and her face contorted in an expression of surprise and worry, as what she had just heard was completely unexpected and left her completely confused, making her feel helpless. The mansion Jonah was in looked amazing. It was a large and majestic building surrounded by green foliage and ancient trees that created a sense of privacy and tranquility, almost a fairy tale atmosphere like in old novels. The maid, bowing modestly before her mistress, uttered words that made a strange impression on Jonah, declaring that from that moment on, she and her relatives would serve her faithfully and devotedly, fulfilling all her wishes with complete readiness and without questions. The girl, whose eyes sparkled with delight and joy, was sincerely happy that she had received such an opportunity to serve their princess, considering it a real honor, and her face glowed as if she had just fulfilled her cherished dream, not expecting such a turn of events. Jonah, feeling her nerves stretch, awkwardly recoiled from the words of the enthusiastic maid, who declared that she would now serve the princess with complete loyalty and devotion, experiencing a strange feeling of uneasiness and bewilderment, not knowing how to react. Young Dorothy turned out to be a truly good person. She always brought tea with a smile, radiating kindness and a sincere desire to please, like a servant who is devoted to her role and cares for her mistress with immense devotion and affectionate gestures. The beautiful Jonah herself, sitting in the room and absorbed in gloomy thoughts, thought that the maid turned out to be her sincere fan, since she showed so much enthusiasm that at times it seemed that her admiration was too obvious and even somewhat excessive for Jonah. Suddenly, Jonah flinched as someone spoke to her forcefully, breaking her thoughts and tearing her out of the prolonged silence she had been trying to maintain, as if it was her refuge from the events happening around her that she was losing control over. Dorothy, with a noticeable concern in her voice, asked her if the lady had become ill because of the Emperor's funeral, which was to take place today, trying to find out if everything was all right, and if Jonah did not feel very worried about it, which was quite natural at such a moment. The lady, after thinking for a moment, agreed with the maid, but without losing time, hurried her to finish her hair faster, as she was not in the mood to linger and preferred to finish everything as quickly as possible in order to return to her thoughts. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door, which broke the peace and added even more tension to the atmosphere, forcing everyone present to freeze and pay attention to what was happening behind the door, a harbinger of something important and, perhaps, not entirely expected. It was the prince who entered the room with a light and confident smile, as if not noticing all the tension around him, and declared that he had come here to personally see off his sister, which in his words sounded like an indisputable fact that left no room for objections. With a smile, the princess answered her brother that she was fine, and, reassured by his concern, she sat quietly until he stood next to her, trying with his presence to convey to her confidence and support in this difficult moment, filling her soul with peace and warmth. As they walked down the long corridor together, the boy suddenly, as if realizing the importance of the moment, turned to his sister, telling her not to worry, and added that he would always protect her, promising that no difficulties, no fears, no trials could stop him. Armand smiled brightly, a blush appeared on his cheeks, and with a sincere expression on his face, he asked the girl to trust him, assuring her that she would never be alone in this world, and that she should not worry, because he was always there, ready to come to the rescue at any moment, even if the world around her was collapsing. Above their heads was a cloudless blue sky, and in the distance they could see the majestic imperial cathedral standing in the middle of the city, its tall towers rising high and its round windows reflecting the light, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and grandeur that could touch the heart. There, in the very center of the cathedral, was the coffin of the emperor, resting in his final rest, surrounded by fresh flowers that symbolized respect and memory of the great ruler, whose passing left a deep mark on history and in the hearts of his subjects, making everyone think about eternity. The girl sat on a bench, watching her brothers say goodbye to their dead father, and all this happened in silence, filled with deep respect and sorrow, as her heart sank with pain for the loss of the great ruler whose wise decisions determined their destinies. Gently, reverently, the men's hands placed the flower on the chest of the former emperor, symbolizing the respect and great love they all felt for their ruler. His passing left a void that could not be filled by anything, not even time. The noblewoman pretended to be crying bitterly and grieving for her departed father. Her face was lit up with an expression of sadness. She stood next to him, as if trying to prove to everyone that her heart was breaking from loss, but inside there was more terrible despair than real tears. Suddenly, another tall figure appeared next to her, and she suddenly looked at the girl in amazement, not expecting to see her in such a state, which made her gaze stop, as if trying to understand what exactly was happening here and what brought her here. The stranger also brought a white flower with him, to pay tribute to grief and respect, to mourn the dead emperor like everyone else, and, having become part of this ceremony, his presence seemed an integral part of this difficult and sorrowful moment that changed their lives forever. It was Bonaparte, who played his role masterfully and sympathetically, said that it was hard for him to stand before the former emperor, although he himself was responsible for his death, hiding his guilt behind a mask of deep sorrow, skillfully manipulating those around him. Jonah looked at him with horror and dark disappointment. Her gaze was full of pain and bewilderment. She could not believe that he was so convincing in his performance. His words sounded so sincere, as if he really grieved for the man he himself killed. Slowly and with restraint, she began to descend the steps, her steps quiet but heavy, as if the weight of the ceremony was pressing on her shoulders, causing her heart to squeeze with bitterness, pain and the bitter realization that life would never be the same. And her soul was filled with disgust at what was happening around her. Jonah returned to her place and sat on the bench, lowering her head, as if the whole world around her had disappeared, and she could no longer face the truth that was opening up before her, leaving only emptiness, despair, and pain in her heart, as if she had lost not just her father, but her entire previous life. The people of the empire wept, and the tears were sincere, for the emperor was a good ruler who had passed away too soon, leaving behind the shadow of a great loss that neither time nor loyal subjects could forget. And even those who knew of his shortcomings felt how hard it would be to live in a world without him. But then the Duke suddenly appeared next to her, and without even bothering to look in her direction, he coldly asked her if she had noticed that the tears of the other nobles were completely false and phony, without a drop of sincerity. It was all a game. After all, the emperor himself, as it turned out, was far from being such a kind person as he was portrayed in rumors. In reality, he was an extremely fickle and much more cruel person. His interests were exclusively selfish and aimed only at personal gain. Bonaparte lowered his head and bit his lip slightly, sighing as he stated that many here in this company hated the imperial family and were ready to kill every one of its representatives without hesitation for a moment, if only the right opportunity presented itself. And the author of the book, as she previously thought that it would be really cool to add mind reading to the main villain, realized how stupid she was at that moment, because it could completely ruin the whole idea, and she never realized how it could change the plot. Young Bonaparte sat down closer to his bride. With a light and mysterious smile, he started a conversation. His manners and behavior were such that it was impossible to understand what hidden intentions and goals he was pursuing behind these outwardly good-natured words and looks. After which he playfully added, looking at her face, that he would like to completely concentrate only on her, not paying attention to everything else around. His gaze was full of carefree confidence and even some kind of mysterious warmth that made her heart beat faster. The princess blushed completely, feeling shame creeping up on her face, and asked herself how he could make advances towards her so shamelessly and without any embarrassment, not understanding why her heart suddenly began to beat so strongly and unpredictably, losing all confidence. The young man gently asked her to think only about the good and not to worry about trifles, because worries will not help in anything. They will only overshadow the joy and real moments that she can experience with him, if only she can finally let go of all her doubts. The first thing she thought of was the chicken legs, fried with aromatic spices, which were served so deliciously in one old restaurant where she loved to go, enjoying every moment of this simple but tasty and satisfying food, which always brought pleasure. After which her thoughts turned to the rides in the amusement park, where she once rode the carousels, forgetting about everything in the world, enjoying the childish joy and the feeling of flight, because it was one of the happiest and brightest memories of her childhood, which she loved so much. When the Duke asked what these strange things were that the noblewoman was thinking about, the girl, a little embarrassed, told him about her world, about the time that had already passed, but left in her memory vivid memories and feelings full of touching moments. She clearly remembered the happiness she had felt while riding on the rides, on the carousel with horses, when everything around seemed magical and beautiful, like in her childhood dreams, and her heart was filled with joy from simple pleasures that she no longer experienced. To the Duke's strange questions, the lovely Jonah fidgeted in place, slightly embarrassed, saying that these were not real horses, but just toys made of some material so that children could ride them without any danger, but they still brought happiness. The Duke kept his eyes on the girl, listening attentively to her stories about the world of the future, about those distant times when everything was different, and his interest only grew. He tried to understand what made her talk like that, what was hidden behind her words and the memories she mentioned. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a priest, who loudly declared to the entire hall that the moment of purification had arrived, and everyone present fell silent, listening intently to his words, a harbinger of an important event that was about to happen right now, filling everyone with anticipation. He opened a book, on the pages of which there was no holy scripture written, only mysterious lines, in which some deep meaning was hidden, incomprehensible to most, but so exciting to everyone who was here, waiting for an important and mystical moment. He stood next to the dead emperor and, bowing, began to read him a prayer, pronouncing each word with the greatest respect and concentration, his voice sounding solemn and penetrating, as if he wanted to bring this man's soul back to life. The girl watched this process with surprise and delight. Her eyes glowed with interest. She was so absorbed in what was happening that she could not tear herself away from looking at the priest, feeling some indescribable atmosphere that reigned in the hall, and at the same time her soul was filled with anxiety. The priest spoke strange words, his voice sounded like an ancient spell, and an aura began to shine around him, as if the atmosphere itself responded to these prayers, filling the hall with a mystical energy that everyone present felt, as if magic was in the air. Suddenly the Duke screamed in pain, pressing his hands to himself, his face distorted with fear and pain, and Jonah immediately rushed to ask what was wrong with him, noticing how his body began to react to an unknown force, which was clearly not happening by his will and was unimaginably scary. The beauty shuddered in surprise when she saw what was happening to the Duke. Her eyes widened in shock and her heart skipped a beat when she realized that his suffering was caused by something supernatural, something she could not even imagine. The man's hand turned black, as if struck by a dark, poisonous curse that he had received when he dared to go against God himself, and this blackness spread like a disease, engulfing his body, causing him to suffer in a cruel torment that could not be stopped. Breathing hard, he cast a look of anger and hostility at the lady, his eyes blazing with rage, and he said that she knew for certain that his power was not in harmony with God's blessing, and that it was she who was to blame for his fall, betraying him with her curse that doomed him to suffering. The beauty, frightened and alarmed, froze, realizing that her actions had indeed led to what was happening to him. After all, as the author of this world, she had endowed him with this terrible curse, not realizing the full seriousness of the consequences of her actions and their tragic inevitability. Suddenly, the young man stood up abruptly, despite his pain, and gritting his teeth, walked away without looking back, leaving her with a heavy feeling of guilt and confusion, as if his fate had already been decided, and her intervention had only accelerated this process. The princess looked after him with sadness, her eyes full of disappointment, and her mouth slightly opened as a sad tear appeared on her face, a harbinger of her inner pain and regret that she could not change this course of events, no matter how hard she tried. According to her idea, as the author of the novel, the young Duke was cursed and could not be within the church walls. His heart was so heavy that even a sword had to pierce it to free him from this curse that hung over him like a deadly shadow, haunting him. The servant hurried to the master, informing him that after the funeral, one of the representatives of the church had arrived, which could not but cause discontent in the man, because at such an important and difficult moment, it was completely inappropriate for the priest to start joking and having fun. This situation clearly did not please the gentleman, because it seemed absolutely unacceptable to him that the priests, instead of observing due respect and reverence, began to joke with him at such a serious moment, and he immediately ordered the servant to drive them away. After this, the Duke, sitting at his workplace, reminded everyone present of the imminent appearance of his betrothed, the lady with whom he was to unite his fate, despite all the contradictions and problems that arose on his path, and all that was now required of him was to follow his decision. The prince was categorically against this marriage, and it was impossible to convince him otherwise. His determination was so strong that any persuasion could not influence his opinion, and he stood his ground to the end, not wanting to give in on anything. absolutely sure that he was doing the right thing. For now the princess could not act openly, because if she decided to commit murder, it would be too suspicious and would attract unnecessary attention, undermining her plans and destroying the entire carefully constructed plan, which could become a fatal mistake that would destroy her future. The red curtains on the windows of the mansion's corridor gave the entire room an atmosphere of privacy and coziness. Their bright color contrasted with the rest of the interior, creating an indescribable feeling of warmth and comfort that was impossible not to notice. When the gentleman asked where Jonah was, the servant replied that she was with other ladies at a tea party in the palace, where a rather cozy and pleasant evening was taking place, filled with conversations and laughter, which of course could not leave the gentleman indifferent. Bonaparte, hearing this answer, suddenly raised his head, not expecting such a turn of events, and, remaining slightly perplexed, asked the servant again, not believing his ears, since this answer clearly did not correspond to his expectations and completely confused him. The sky was clear, without a single cloud, which gave the whole view a special magnificence, as if everything in the world was in its place, and there were no obstacles to the harmony that reigned around, filling everything around with light and tranquility. The lady was dressed in a new orange dress, which emphasized her refined taste and elegance, and smiling sweetly, she looked ahead, as if immersed in her thoughts, enjoying the moment and the invisible atmosphere of peace and confidence that reigned around her. Next to her at a small table stood cups of tea and sweets, as well as two more noble girls dressed in elegant dresses, one green, the other blue, each of which was no less exquisite, creating an indescribable feeling of harmony and comfort. Just recently, a servant came running to the princess and, slightly out of breath from running fast, announced that two ladies had come to visit her and asked for a personal audience with the noblewoman, which surprised her quite a bit, since such visits were rarely so unexpected. Jonah winced at this news, because usually before a visit, she was always sent letters to warn of her arrival. But these girls behaved rudely and unexpectedly, which did not fit at all into her usual order and her understanding of upbringing. Arleon, a lady with dark hair and blue eyes, dressed in a darker dress, was truly beautiful, and with a slight smile, said that she would like to become friends with the princess, perhaps in the future to find a common language and establish contact to establish connections. Another lady named Parisa, also smiling, said that, living in the palace, the princess might not have known all the news that circulated among the aristocracy, and they, as representatives of high society, could be useful to her and reveal to her much that she had not yet heard. Jonah laughed loudly with a forced smile, covering her mouth with her hand, and thanked the lady for her visit, not hiding her displeasure at their unexpected appearance and unusual behavior, which she did not like at all, but she tried to remain polite. She could not help but notice how the lovely lady looked with curiosity and hidden interest at her ring, which she proudly wore on her finger, and obviously had already guessed about her upcoming wedding with the Duke, because this was the reason they came. Society should have been in great shock at the news of such an intimate and unexpected union as a wedding between a nobleman and a beauty, because such a union always attracts attention, and even more so when it comes to such interesting characters. The princess took a cup of tea in her hands, took a small sip, and without hiding her confidence, said that yes, it was true, and soon her marriage with the Duke would take place, because these events were already predetermined by fate, and she only had to wait for them to happen. The noblewomen listened attentively to Iona's words, trying to understand whether the rumors about her imminent marriage to the Duke were true, because such news always excites society, and rumors about this could not help but arouse their keen interest and curiosity, which they could not help but guess. After which Arleon, after a short pause, suddenly spoke up and, with a slight smile, asked if the princess liked the tea, since it was precisely that special leaf tea that her family, famous for its unique variety, delivered from the best gardens, always supplied. Parisa, raising her finger, confirmed that this drink was indeed rare and imported from distant lands, and therefore was a real delicacy that only the most intelligent and wealthy families, famous for their traditions, could afford. The noblewoman thought awkwardly that, unfortunately, if it weren't for Jonah but the real princess was here now, she would have definitely taken the words of these ladies at face value, not noticing the hidden hints and unobtrusive attempts to manipulate her opinion, which would have turned out to be a serious mistake. She would definitely not understand the mockery, and with a wide smile, she joyfully exclaimed how great it was that she was brought such a rare and exquisite tea, not suspecting that her words could be perceived differently than she thought, thereby creating an uneasy atmosphere and slight tension. The woman's hand reached out to a fragile cup of aromatic tea in which a flower was floating, and, having barely touched it, the lady studied it with interest, as if expecting some new impressions, which only added sophistication to her image and the whole situation. And soon one of the ladies, breaking the silence, said that after import, all the products had passed customs control, but there had been no recent notifications of any changes in their business, which suddenly attracted attention and created a little doubt. Flowers, carefully removed from cups of delicious tea, were placed nearby on the floor, as if in respect for the drink and as a symbol emphasizing the significance of the moment, which caused a feeling of slight bewilderment and anxiety in all those present. Lady Arlene jumped up from her seat and began to justify herself, nervously sorting through her words, as if trying to find a suitable explanation, but her anxiety was obvious, and this could not help but alert everyone present, including the princess, who was watching everything carefully. The same was done by the lovely Lady Parisa sitting next to me, who, visibly agitated, hastened to say that everything could be justified, but her words sounded unconvincing, as if she were trying to hide something more than just an accidental mistake or misunderstanding. The girl tried to explain that their tea was not prestigious enough to be served in places like the palace, but her excuses sounded forced, and this only made the situation worse, raising doubts about the sincerity of her words and intentions. The ladies were frightened by the princess's cold words, which seemed to indicate an obvious quality problem, and apparently the customs officers were indeed having problems correctly assessing what they were bringing, which only added to the strangeness of the situation. Young Jonah suggested that the ladies discuss all the issues with the prince in order to find a final solution to the problem that had arisen, believing that only with his participation would it be possible to sort out the current situation and avoid possible unpleasant consequences for all parties. The girls, upon hearing her proposal, immediately became worried, trying in every way to dissuade the princess from this step, because they were well aware that her decision could lead to unexpected consequences for them, and they could find themselves in a very difficult situation. Without waiting for their answers, Jonah decisively declared, saying goodbye to the ladies and asking the maid to lead the guests to the exit, since, in her opinion, the time of their visit had already expired, and it was time to end this conversation, which, it seemed, would not bring anything good. At that moment, the sound of someone's feet approaching the door was heard, and the whole room froze in anticipation, holding its breath, as if all participants in the situation intuitively felt that something could change at any moment, because each of the ladies knew perfectly well that everything could go wrong. The handsome duke, shocked and stunned by what was happening, watched as the two ladies, frightened and panicked, ran away in haste, fearing that their social status would fall, and they would find themselves in an unkind situation that could cost them everything. Their anxiety was caused by a terrible fear that their impeccable reputation and high social status would be destroyed, that they would lose the respect of society, and that their lives would change for the worse, plunging them into an abyss of uncertainty, fear, and anxiety. Suddenly, a vivid picture of the princess with her black eyes, her confident and firm gait, her hands clenched into fists, as if she were ready to fight any difficulties, arose in his memory. He was overcome by a strange feeling of bewilderment and surprise at her unexpected determination and fortitude. Quietly, as if deep in thought, he repeated his words, hoping that Jonah would finally stop behaving so carelessly and recklessly as she had before. Perhaps his bride would finally realize that she needed to become a more sensible and mature woman. Jonah stood up on her feet with difficulty and irritation, feeling how fatigue covers her body. Every movement is difficult, when suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by someone's voice, forcing her to stop for a moment and gather her strength, ready to meet any surprise. The young girl froze when she was suddenly told that the Duke himself had arrived to see her, and despite all her fatigue, her heart involuntarily skipped a couple of beats, and her thoughts quickly raced, trying to understand what he wanted from her this time, and what he needed right now. With a slight smile on her lips, the noblewoman invited the man inside with a playful glint in her eyes, but deep down she wondered what this idiot wanted from her again, and she held back the desire to express her irritation, showing neither weakness nor fatigue. The man firmly ordered the maid to leave and flatly stated that there was no need to serve tea when he finally entered the room, creating the feeling that his presence was more than enough for everyone else, even for her and her mood. After which, unexpectedly for everyone, the lovely Bonaparte presented the noblewoman with a gift, a large pink box, exquisitely decorated with a subtle shine and a mysteriously enigmatic atmosphere, causing her gaze to linger on this object, full of anticipation. When the box was opened, inside were exquisite desserts, airy macarons, cakes with refined sweet fillings, temptingly peeking out from the luxurious packaging, which in itself was a real work of art and surprised with its style. The man explained with a slight smile that he wanted to please her by giving her this exquisite and thoughtful gift, and then, as if out of habit, decided to add some sweets, so that, as he believed, he could please her even more at this moment and surprise her with something truly unusual. The beauty, a little surprised but at the same time flattered by such a gesture of attention, hesitantly asked why he had made such a generous and unexpected gift, and Bonaparte, as if thoughtfully, continued to look at her with a mysterious smile, not immediately answering, which made her feel nervous. The Duke raised an eyebrow in confusion and noted that the lady no longer hid her thoughts, but spoke everything directly, as if her previously suppressed feelings had suddenly found a voice that was as frank as her words, without any hints or hidden meanings. The woman's hands tightly clutched the large box of desserts, as if trying to find support in this gesture, which became her small protection from her own doubts and worries, so as not to show how much she was worried at this moment, struggling with growing anxiety. The girl exhaled, gathered her strength, and firmly said that she would try to convince her brother that their wedding with the Duke would truly be favorable and would only bring benefits to the family, despite all the past doubts, disagreements, and experiences. An important party in honor of their imminent marriage was soon to take place, and the Scarlet Hall with its luxurious curtains and chandeliers promised to be the place where everything had to be perfectly organized to create an atmosphere of magnificence and make an indelible impression on all the guests present. With a sweet smile but firm in her voice, the beauty confidently said that she would convince her brother of the rightness of their wedding, and that everything would be fine, because she was ready to fight for the future, which, in her opinion, should be full of happiness, harmony, and confidence in the future. Suddenly the Duke covered his mouth with his hand and smiled, noticing that the princess was no longer laughing, and her face had acquired a strange expression that betrayed the inner experiences and doubts that she tried to hide, but was unable to keep them under control. After that, he pointed his finger at her and, with a slight ironic smile, declared that it was time for him to leave, and therefore, please, deviate. The man's words sounded with such a shade as if he was barely holding back his mockery, hinting at the end of their communication. The beauty, holding back her displeasure, selfishly hugged the gift of desserts to herself, as if trying to emphasize her independence, and with a slight grin said that whether to eat them or not was purely her personal business, and she did not allow anyone to interfere with her choice. After which, with her feminine fingers, carefully, as if choosing the best one, the aristocrat grabbed a macaroon, bright yellow, reminiscent of the devil's color, and with curiosity decided to try it, thinking about how it would match her mood at that moment. When Jonah bit into the sweet, her eyes filled with delight and her cheeks flushed with pleasure. It was so delicious that she could hardly hide her pleasure, feeling how the sweetness spread across her taste buds, and a joyful thrill flashed through her heart. Bonaparte went away but stopped at the door, with his arms folded on his chest, and stood still for a moment, as if something in his thoughts made him linger, despite all his desire to go. He left the dear Iona alone, forcing her to plunge into thought and doubt. She made a firm decision to cultivate fortitude in herself and, gathering all her determination, promised herself that she would have exactly 2 days to convince the prince to give her permission to marry the duke, despite all the possible obstacles and warnings that awaited her. The girl, holding her breath and carefully choosing each step, slowly moved along the long, semi-dark corridor, thoughts floating in her head about how she could convince her brother to accept her marriage to the duke, despite all his hatred for this man. Along the way, she couldn't help but feel uneasy, thinking that perhaps she would be lucky if her brother didn't decide to rush to the duke again to talk about her decision and try to ruin her plans, as he had done before. The author thought that she might be really lucky in life if her brother did not rush to the duke again to discuss her decision, because she knew how strongly he was against this marriage and how he could interfere with her plans and ruin them. She continued to reflect that her brother was a kind and honest child, and if she found the right words, explained everything to him properly, and opened her point of view to him, he might still agree to this marriage, despite his fierce opposition. The lady immediately dropped her hands when her brother suddenly exploded, sharply declaring that she was talking complete nonsense, not understanding how she could have proposed such a crazy idea that violated all his ideas about what was right and destroyed her own plans. Armand took a decisive step towards his sister, with obvious bewilderment and anger in his eyes, saying how could she even think that he would give his consent to this marriage, despite all his commitment to the family and its stubborn, sometimes ill-considered decisions. His hand was clenched into a fist and trembling with tension, as if ready to discharge at any moment, while he stood in front of his sister, trying to understand how she could hope for his support in such a crazy and completely impossible situation that shocked him. With tears in his eyes, young Armand asked her sharply how she could ask him for something so cruel and inhuman, not realizing that he could never agree to it, despite her desperate requests and persistence that hurt his soul. Whereupon, with firmness in his voice and full resolution, he told the lady that he would not let this pass, that he would not let her wish come true, for the Duke was a cunning and dangerous villain, and she should not get involved with such a man whom he truly despised. Gently, feminine hands took his hands, trying to soften his anger and at least a little dispel the internal tension, and he felt how her touches, soft and warm, calmed his storm for a moment, but still could not dispel the shadow of doubt that hung heavily between them. With a slight smile, she said that the handsome Bonaparte was not as bad as he thought, and that behind the outward words and actions there was much more than he could imagine, that his opinion of him was biased and unfounded. But Armand tore his hands from hers, his eyes filled with rage, and with anger in his voice he screamed, claiming that the Duke had misled her, manipulated her feelings, and used her trust for his own purposes, wanting only to take advantage of her naivety. Jonah, unable to bear his accusations, showed the ring on her finger, which the Duke had given her as a token of love, promise, and affection, hoping that this indisputable proof would change her brother's mind and make him think at least for a moment about his position. Awkwardly, with obvious doubt in his voice, the young man continued, saying that the Duke could not be trusted, that he was only manipulating her feelings, playing on her weaknesses, and all his words and promises were just empty talk, not worth an ounce of trust and respect. But then Jonah, knowing full well that her brother would not give in so easily and would not accept her point of view without resistance, resolutely said that if the prince really wanted her happiness and sincerely loved her, he should have given his consent to their marriage, and not continue this fruitless struggle, which had already only wounded them both. She gently stroked his cheek, trying to calm her dear brother and convey to him her confidence that everything would be fine, even if everything seemed insurmountable now, and that new trials awaited them ahead, which they would cope with together as always before. The young man, holding back his hidden feelings, gently asked his kind but stupid sister that if something suddenly changed, and she decided to get a divorce, then let her come to him immediately, and he would be there to support her in any situation, as he always did, tirelessly. The next day came and the sunset was special, its fiery rays illuminating the rough earth, creating an incredibly beautiful atmosphere, emphasizing the tension of the moment that seemed like a turning point in their lives and promised the changes in the future that they were waiting for. Jonah stood in a new blue dress. She looked elegant and calm, but the woman's gaze was into the distance, and her thoughts were somewhere far away, as if she did not participate in the event at all, being in her thoughts, not feeling the time and involuntarily moving away. Suddenly the door creaked open, and young Bonaparte entered the room, his gaze confident and his voice quiet as he asked her if she was ready for the celebration that seemed to be about to begin and was full of anticipation, as if the future hung in the balance. The lady covered her mouth with her hand, her voice full of doubt and slight anxiety when she said that he was a true king, an ideal, but his actions still did not always correspond to his high rank, and this disappointed her a little and cast doubt on his true intentions. The man took the glass of drink with his hand, slightly bowing his head. He asked her how the princess was able to convince her brother, because he could not believe that her words could influence his decision so much, changing his mind about everything that happened and making him believe in her sincerity. The girl watched her future husband, who was calmly drinking the drink, his gaze focused, and she noticed with surprise how his thoughts may have changed, and he really began to change his mind about killing her brother, but for now he remained in thought. Barely containing his emotions, the handsome duke covered his face with his hand, his expression becoming tense as if he was trying to hide his inner struggle, and Jonah, standing next to him, pouted angrily, her lips pressed together in an offended gesture, reflecting all her discontent and disappointment. After which he winced and said that he had a severe headache, closing his eyes, trying to hide his dissatisfaction and the pain that clearly did not leave him, despite the outward confidence and calm that he so carefully tried to maintain. Suddenly, she remembered saying the same words when she typed on the keyboard that the main villain was a real pain in the ass, as if these words had become part of her own perception, through which she built the entire image, without realizing how accurate it was. Jonah looked at him thoughtfully, her hand unconsciously touching her face, and she thought that she herself had made an interesting change to the character of the antagonist, adding a few nuances to him that made him more alive and multifaceted, thus adding a human side to him. She then added grief and a cruel past, as well as dark moments from childhood, into the life of the main villain, creating his motivation and internal struggle, which seemed to make him more human and understandable. And at some point she realized how difficult his path was. The glass of drink suddenly slipped from the Duke's hands, its glass making a shrill clinking sound as he realized that everything was starting to take an unexpected turn, and his own feelings were becoming much more complex than he had expected, forcing him to think. Jonah stood frozen in shock, her eyes wide and her mouth hanging open as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her heart was beating faster and she didn't know how to react to what was happening, which seemed impossible, as if all reality around her was collapsing. Bonaparte was furious that the cunning author had ruined the man's life just to make it more interesting for the readers, as if his own experiences and feelings had become just an element of entertainment, manipulated for the sake of a profitable plot. The princess awkwardly stepped back from the man, her face expressing obvious fear, for she was afraid of his anger, not knowing that her words and actions could cause such a furious reaction, which was much stronger than she expected and than she could have imagined. The man's hand reached out to her and a question rang out, full of mad despair, as if his words were the last cry from the depths of his soul. If he killed her, would he himself disappear? Would he lose his essence? Would he dissolve in this same abyss, as if everything that had happened had no meaning or purpose? In fear, the beauty, unable to contain her anxiety, looked with wide-open eyes at the guy's palm, which was so close to the woman's face that she could feel even the slightest gust of air from its movement, causing her an irresistible horror. As the strong Bonaparte, consumed with his anger, suddenly threw his arm around hers, his face became gloomy and his gaze icy as he said that he hated the lovely Jonah with such fury that even he himself was surprised at his patience in her presence. The young man, feeling his nerves giving way, stepped aside, as if wishing to hide his tension, and said in a reserved but confident tone that the lady, after some time, should come to him in the banquet hall, but not to hurry, approaching him not immediately, as fate would have it. The doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, leaving behind an echoing sound that reverberated in the air for a long time, like a harbinger of coming events, felt on an intuitive level, and the silence in the room became heavy, like an approaching storm, ready to fall at any moment. Sweat, like a cold wave, ran over the skin of the hand of the lady who was next to her. Her hand trembled and her fingers clenched, as if trying to hold herself in this moment, not giving in to the panic that in an instant seized her, and not allowing herself to get lost in this chaos of emotions and feelings. Jonah, standing in front of her future husband, found herself at a complete loss, not knowing what to say or how to act, and froze for a moment, her gaze directed into the void, as if she was trying to find answers to questions that had not yet been asked or were completely hidden somewhere in the depths of her mind, haunting her. Suddenly, an unpleasant wave of pain rolled through the woman's entire body, and she, unable to restrain herself, winced, as if this pain penetrated into her essence, forcing her to close her lips in an attempt to suppress the painful sensations that she could not ignore. The lady, noticing something strange, suddenly felt a sharp prick in her finger, and before she could understand what had happened, a drop of blood appeared on her hand, which, like a harbinger of trouble, quietly flowing down her finger, left traces that spoke of something bad that was about to happen, warning against a possible threat. There, on the floor, amidst the relentless chaos, lay the bloody shards of broken glass, quietly reflecting the light, as if reminding that everything here could have ended much worse, and their sharp edges could have been the last warning of the inevitable catastrophe. The girl clenched her teeth, trying to hide the intense pain from those around her, holding back her feelings that were rising with each new attack of fear and despair, not allowing herself to fall, despite the pains tearing her apart, which seemed almost unbearable and eternal. Covering her face with her hands, she felt a tremor run through her body, realizing that she was not ready to accept her fate. She could not believe that this cruel fate had befallen her, that she found herself in such a terrible and irreparable situation. The hall was bustling with various aristocrats, animatedly whispering as they walked through the huge, spacious hall where an important and prestigious event was taking place, and each of them felt like they were becoming part of this difficult, but at the same time magnificent event. The pair walked around the hall. Their blue shoes, made of amethysts, sparkled with every step, attracting the admiring glances of the guests, and seemed like a work of art, capable of enchanting even the most strict and experienced critics with their unusual radiance. Armand, with a slight smile on his face, approached his sister, who had finally made up her mind and come to this ball, and this meant the end of her loneliness. The opportunity to be next to him, despite all her previous doubts and fatigue, to finally feel support. The lady approached her brother and apologized for her lateness, feeling slightly embarrassed, unable to hide her inner uneasiness from everyone around her, as if she was late for the most important event of the evening, which weighed on her soul and made her nervous. When asked how she felt, the wonderful Jonah lied, assuring everyone that everything was fine, because despite her embarrassment and nervousness, it was only because there were too many people here, and this caused her a lot of tension and great fear. Suddenly the lady's thoughts were interrupted by a humble servant who came up and informed them that the ball was about to begin, and they could no longer postpone the important event. He politely indicated that it was time to get ready and take their places, for time was of the essence and everyone was waiting for the beginning. With these words, Jonah was left alone, with her hand outstretched forward, silently standing in the center of the hall, as if her body had frozen, and her thoughts had flown away somewhere far away, dissolving into emptiness, and she felt how her inner anxiety and worry were growing with every moment, tearing her apart from the inside, depriving her of all hope. The noblewoman remembered how the Duke had stretched out his hand to her and asked if sweet Jonah were to be healed like the author of the novel, then he would also die with her, as if following her fate, sharing all her troubles and sorrows that she had to endure alone, carrying her into the abyss. The aristocrat clapped her hands to her cheeks and resolutely decided to pull herself together, casting aside all the doubts and worries that had momentarily overwhelmed her, because she could not allow herself to show weakness in front of those around her, especially at such an important moment. The prince greeted all the nobles who came to the event with a slight smile on his face and a bow. His manners were impeccable as always, and all the guests felt his presence, filled with grandeur and respect, which he so carefully maintained. After that, he clenched his fists, looked at the assembled group with a serious and slightly tense expression on his face, and announced that he had another important piece of news that he had to convey to everyone present, which attracted the attention of all the guests, causing them to freeze in anticipation. And then all eyes turned to the prince when it was said that he and the duchess would soon be getting married, which caused a stir among the guests, and the atmosphere was immediately filled with anticipation and impatience. Everyone began to whisper about the upcoming event, which promised to be significant and unforgettable. Jonah froze awkwardly, feeling her face flush with embarrassment as all eyes focused on her, and she felt unbearably ashamed because she couldn't escape those intense, assessing glances that only increased her anxiety and increased the tension. Suddenly, a strong man's hand unexpectedly grabbed the lady's hand, and the strong but painful grip made her shudder, and her heart skipped a beat as if the whole world around her froze for a moment, and all attention was riveted only on this gesture. It was Bonaparte who, unexpectedly for everyone, dropped on one knee and, with incredible grace, drew her hand to his, causing her not only surprise but also confusion, with each moment increasing her inner embarrassment and the growing feeling of awkwardness that she could not hide. With a smirk that betrayed confidence and audacity, the man said that from that moment on, she was his thing and not the other way around, which shocked those present and caused a wave of whispers, because his words sounded like a challenge, clearly asserting his power and dominance over the princess, leaving her speechless. The lady awkwardly recoiled as the young man called her real name, rather than the title of princess, the body whose place she had taken in this world, and for a moment she felt as if her own personality was dissolving into this new form, creating a feeling of loss and emptiness, as if her existence had no meaning. The woman's hand shook violently in the man's strong grip, as if she was trying with all her might to break free, but something inside her, some inner voice, told her that not everything was so simple, and her resistance was futile, only increasing her anxiety and confusion. She had no chance to escape, and at that moment Bonaparte put his other hand on her shoulder, pressing her even harder, as if not giving her the slightest chance of release, and the whole situation became even more tense, desperate and threatening to her peace. Jonah felt her brother run up behind her, and with the excitement that his every step betrayed, he asked if she was okay. If the Duke had offended her, his worried gaze sought an answer, but in Jonah's eyes there was only confusion and bewilderment that she could not hide. The lady forced a smile and pressed herself a little closer to her future husband, confidently saying that everything was fine, although there was tension in her voice and her gaze betrayed the uncertainty that she tried to hide behind a facade of calm and dignity, trying to show those around her that she was in control of the situation. She then pulled her hand out of her fiancé's tight grip and, sighing slightly, said that she was tired and therefore wanted to go to her room and rest a little, seeking to get away from this tense moment in order to gain at least some sense of control and restore her inner balance. The beauty walked away, holding onto the hem of her dress, her golden hair fluttering like a part of her in the gentle wind that penetrated the hall, giving her movements lightness and a certain dreaminess, as if she were trying to get away from everything that was happening. Bonaparte, standing still, looked after her attentively. His intelligent eyes, like golden lights, followed her every step, and he could not hide his interest. His gaze was focused and full of hidden anticipation, as if he knew that all this was only the beginning. It was deep night then, and the lanterns were burning brightly, and a light wind was rustling the leaves, creating a feeling of strange solitude, as if the whole world around her had frozen, leaving her alone in this moment, filled with anxiety and worry, from which there was no escape anywhere. The girl was breathing heavily as she stepped out into the street, her mouth gulping air as if trying to fill her lungs and calm the anxiety that was squeezing her chest, and her heart was beating faster with every step, as if she was trying to escape from something that was chasing her. The woman's hand, the blue sleeve of her dress, tightly clenched her fingers into a fist, as if the rage that was growing inside her demanded an immediate outlet, and her every step became a reflection of the struggle for freedom. trying to get rid of this oppression that was squeezing her heart, not allowing her to find peace. For a moment the lady paused, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon, wondering how she could be in this world where her place and goals were still unclear, where each new day brought new trials, and where ahead loomed a path full of uncertainty and unknown dangers. Suddenly there was a sharp creak from the gate, and Jonah turned around with a start, feeling a strange uneasiness fill her chest, as if something in the silence of the night had been broken, causing her heart to beat faster and everything around her to become ominous. There, on the fence, the beautiful noblewoman noticed a man in a red hood, his stern gaze directed straight at her, and in his eyes there was some awkwardness, as if he was unsure of his intentions, and his presence only increased her growing anxiety. Frightened, she made a movement, trying to open her mouth to warn of a possible threat, and scream that a thief had come, but instead only an uncertain muttering escaped from her throat, which she could not hold back, and the words seemed to be stuck in her throat, not wanting to come out. The young man, looking at her with fear, his deep blue eyes, dark brown hair, and face hidden by a hood, quietly asked her to wait and not to scream, as if he was afraid that her scream could attract unnecessary attention, attracting undeserved fear and anxiety. Without thinking twice, he suddenly jumped from the fence towards her. Her heart began to beat faster, and putting his hand in front of him, he tried to cover her mouth so that she would not scream and attract unnecessary glances, acting quickly and decisively without any explanations or attempts to speak. Roughly, and without hesitation, he covered her mouth so that she would not call anyone for help, which made the girl shudder and feel her heart beat faster from fear and confusion, not knowing what to do next in such a situation full of danger and tension, causing her to freeze. The boy was handsome in the night light, his features highlighted by the dim light, and quietly asking her to be quiet, he assured her that if she did not scream and left everything in the shadow of the night, then he would not harm her, which sounded like a promise, but it was hard to trust him, standing before him in complete confusion. After which he carefully let her go, allowing the lady to finally breathe normally, removing his hand from her face, feeling how the tension subsided a little, and she could at least a little feel safe, although fear and terrible anxiety were still raging inside. Suddenly, the princess, unable to restrain herself, grabbed the guy by the hand and with a strong blow sent him to the ground, from which he fell heavily, feeling sharp pain, and the lady, standing nearby, felt how her feelings overwhelmed her, not knowing what to do at that moment. The color drained from her face and she stood there, confused, her heart pounding, her hands instinctively covering her chest as if trying to protect herself from what had happened, and her eyes showing helplessness, not knowing how to deal with this unexpected and overwhelming moment. After which, unable to bear it any longer, she began to scream, loudly and desperately declaring that an attempt had been made on her life, her voice trembling with fear and confusion, trying to convince those around her that she was really in danger, despite all the guy's attempts to stop her. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, Dorothy appeared, rapidly approaching the princess. She was dressed in a brown dress. Her steps were confident and fast, and her gaze was focused, as if she had long known that she had to intervene and calm the situation, because something was clearly wrong at this moment. The handsome young man, noticing her approach, grinned reservedly and put his red hood back on, trying to hide his face, as if he wanted to disappear into the shadows, leaving behind only mystery and innuendo, as if that was his main desire. Young Jonah extended her feminine hand, trying to stop him, but he had already disappeared, vanished into the night like a ghost, leaving no trace except for the mysterious feeling that everything was not as it seemed at first, and that this was only the beginning of something much more complex. Looking at his back, the girl whispered angrily, calling him a bad thief. Her words were full of contempt and discontent, reflecting her inner rage at how everything was unfolding at this moment. She couldn't believe that everything went so unexpectedly. The man in red turned out to be a cardinal of the church, and a nun was quickly following him, shouting that he should not have left, that his action was not only absurd but also dangerous, because he could not leave the sacred walls of the monastery, where his duty was important to everyone. Irritably, the stern cardinal replied that usually the boy adhered to strict canons and acted in order, but today he had a good reason to leave, a reason that outweighed all traditions and prohibitions, and this decision was not easy, but necessary. Finally, the nobleman took off his hood, looking at the assembled people with slight contempt, and with a slight hint of irritation, he declared that he had never liked lavish official banquets, where falsehood and boring traditions always reigned, preferring more secluded and sincere meetings where one could feel free and not limited by rules. Turning to his cloak, he suddenly noticed a strange mark on the fabric, which immediately attracted the man's attention. It was a bite left by someone, and its strangeness could not help but alarm him. For a long time he could not understand who could dare to hurt him. The cardinal was stunned to see the blood, as his defenses were usually impeccable and no one could breach them without causing a reaction. At that moment, the impeccable nobleman felt his confidence shaken, a fact that shook him to the core. The nun, noticing the incident, glanced at him with surprise and alarm, not understanding who could have decided to take such a step, and asked in bewilderment who dared to cause such harm to such an important and respected person that it violated his inviolability. Apparently, whoever had bitten him was not a random opponent, but someone who knew how to penetrate the cardinal's defense, because the bite was too precise and decisive to be just a random incident, and it made one think of a hidden threat that no one could even suspect. With a sly grin, a hint of mockery and barely noticeable anticipation, the cardinal declared that everything was becoming more and more interesting, as if fate had decided to arrange for him some kind of sophisticated performance in which he was not only a spectator but also a key participant, and that this only made it more fun for him. Bonaparte, lost in thought, read the documents attentively, keeping his gaze riveted to the lines, sliding over each letter with special attention, as if these papers contained a truth capable of changing his plans, and only the slight movement of his fingers betrayed his inner tension. Keeping the office quiet, the worried servant carefully asked his busy master if there was anything wrong with these documents, since Bonaparte's expression was becoming more and more focused, and in his eyes one could see a barely perceptible shadow of doubt, which appeared extremely rarely. Placing his hand near the neatly folded folder of documents, the guy asked the servants with a slight excitement in his voice where exactly the guests were located at their wedding, hoping that everything was organized perfectly and flawlessly, because this day was supposed to be the most important moment in his life. The venue chosen for the celebration was a place fit for royalty, the majestic Orchid Palace, renowned for its exquisite beauty, luxurious interiors and gardens immersed in fragrant flowers, creating an atmosphere of a secluded fairy tale full of grandeur and charm. The Palace of the Roses, no less magnificent, belonged to a princess whose refinement and grace matched the elegance of the place, and its splendor attracted many, but only a few had the honor of being within its walls, permeated with the scent of flowers and the secrets of palace receptions. The Duke bowed his head in annoyance, feeling frustration boiling up inside him as his servants seemed unable to do anything properly without his strict orders, and even simple things like preparing for an event required his constant intervention, which drove him crazy. To the Duke's persistent and clearly dissatisfied question about another important event, the servants answered with respectful restraint that the prince's coronation was proceeding strictly according to plan, without the slightest delay or complication, and all preparations had been carried out taking into account the highest standards of royal etiquette. Bonaparte slammed his palm down on the table, causing the inkwell to shake and the papers to scatter slightly, and after a short pause filled with tense silence, he coldly and distinctly told the servant that he might as well go, since his presence was no longer required and was only an annoyance. The doors slammed with a loud echo, shaking the air in the room, and the sound of them closing echoed throughout the corridor like a distant rumble of thunder, filling the room with a feeling of deep isolation and loneliness that hung in the air like a heavy blanket. The nobleman slowly lowered his head, as if under the weight of his own thoughts, and, running his hand over his face, in a quiet but hidden tension-filled voice, called the man by the name he had not spoken to out loud for a long time, a name that still resonated in his soul with a strange echo. Sade. Suddenly, as if appearing out of nowhere, another man appeared behind the Duke, whose presence went unnoticed, and it turned out that he had deliberately ignored the nobleman during their previous meeting related to the princess and the Cardinal, as if preferring to keep that information to himself. The man, hidden in the darkness, said in a voice barely above a whisper that he had witnessed Jonah unexpectedly run into the Cardinal yesterday after a sumptuous banquet, and that this meeting did not seem to be accidental, which aroused his suspicions, which he felt it necessary to convey to the Duke. Bonaparte, without showing any particular emotion, coldly ordered his commander to continue to discreetly observe the couple, not missing a single detail of their communication, because he understood that in such circumstances any insignificant detail could play a decisive role in his further actions. The Duke, standing in the hall, was clearly displeased. His irritation was betrayed by his clenched fingers and tense gaze, because the thought that his bride was meeting with a priest without his knowledge was not just unpleasant for him, but insulting, because he was used to controlling everything that concerned her life. On the street, among the spreading trees, there was an elegant gazebo immersed in greenery, and next to it a lantern shone with a soft light, illuminating the delicate outlines of the foliage, through which the golden rays of the sun broke through, creating an atmosphere of comfort and peace, filled with silence and a light rustle of the wind. Hot tea flowed in a thin stream from an exquisite porcelain teapot into an elegant cup, and the aroma of a freshly brewed drink filled the air with warm, spicy notes, as if inviting one to slow down time and enjoy this simple, but such a pleasant moment when nothing disturbs the soul. The maid, with a light grace of movement, carefully poured the drink for her mistress, and she, sitting in a comfortable chair with an upright posture, smiled sweetly, watching this action, as if enjoying the very atmosphere of calm and solitude, in which there was neither haste nor fuss. The day was truly beautiful. A serene blue sky stretched overhead, fresh green grass covered the ground with a soft carpet, the trees whispered something with their leafy whisper, and a light breeze brought with it a feeling of harmony and serene happiness. Upset and slightly depressed, Dorothy muttered that she would hardly be able to help the princess if something unexpected happened to her, or, God forbid, someone attacked her, because there were too many threats in this world against which she was powerless, and this thought worried her more and more. Jonah, who seemed completely calm, without showing the slightest concern, gently asked her maid to prepare a bath for her immediately after tea, as if wanting to wash away the fatigue of the day and allow herself to forget herself for a while in warm water, surrounded by the aromas of rare herbs. As a result, the girl was left alone on the spacious veranda, where a light breeze swayed the translucent curtains, and, sitting at the table, she slowly drank tea, enjoying every drop, allowing her thoughts to wander freely, taking her far from reality, into a world of reflections and mysteries. Suddenly the girl became curious. Who was that mysterious man in the red hood whom she saw last night? Was he really a thief, or was there something more hidden behind his appearance that she could not yet guess? He was then strikingly handsome. There was something attractive and mysterious in his appearance, but the strangest thing was that, no matter how much she remembered, she could not understand whether such a character was in her own novel or whether he appeared in her life from somewhere outside. He had extraordinary eyes, in which shades of cold silver and pure blue were intertwined, like ice shards that caught the light of the moon, giving his gaze an unnatural depth and a mysterious attraction that was impossible to look away from. A perfectly built, handsome man with aristocratic features, his appearance combined strength and grace, nobility and audacity, and the scarlet color of his clothes, a red jacket with a hood that hid part of his face, only emphasized his unpredictability and mysterious charm. And suddenly, as if her thoughts had taken on flesh, the princess recoiled as the very same man she had just been trying to picture in her mind suddenly appeared right in front of her, waving his hand lightly in a welcoming gesture, as if his appearance here was something completely ordinary. The beautiful noblewoman flinched so sharply that her hands involuntarily hit the edge of the table, causing the teacup to sway and tilt dangerously, as if reality had just cracked open, releasing into this world someone she hadn't expected to see so soon. The young man, acting quickly, grabbed her wrist and pulled her towards him in one confident movement. His voice was low and calm, but there was a hidden threat in it when he whispered that she should not make noise because it would be completely unnecessary, and unnecessary noise always attracts the wrong people. The noblewoman, catching her breath, broke free from his grip and quickly took a few steps back, as if trying to create at least some safe distance between them, her heart pounding wildly and her gaze darting between his eyes, in which an incomprehensible gleam shone, and his strange smile. The young man merely shrugged, as if he saw nothing surprising in her panic, and said with a slight mockery that being a killer was too boring and predictable, and there was a casual playfulness in his voice, as if he was hinting that he had much more interesting things to do than someone else's life or death. The girl pointed in amazement at his hair, the shade of which was strikingly strange, shimmering now with a muted green, now with a light silvery gray, as if it did not belong to a person, but were part of something magical, fickle, like a mirage come to life. But before she could ask the question, the man, with a barely noticeable grin, ran his hand through his hair, and in an instant, thanks to magic, its color changed, turning into scarlet as bright as his clothes, and before her stood a completely different person, frighteningly new but still just as mysterious. However, the real shock for the princess came the next moment, when he suddenly appeared before her not just as a magician, but as a priest, and something unearthly appeared in his appearance, a divine power emanating in waves, as if proving that his nature was far from human. She instinctively took a few steps back, her gaze darting between his face and the halo of energy around him, until finally she asked if he really was the priest she had seen before, but the young man replied with a slight smile that such things were not allowed for them at all. When the princess asked him suspiciously why he needed a disguise at all, the young man looked away, avoiding her gaze, and, reluctantly exhaling, briefly replied that he could not tell her the truth, as if this knowledge could change too much or jeopardize something important. The young girl, not hiding her growing mistrust, narrowed her eyes and asked directly what reasons he had for taking someone's life, because murder is always an extreme, and for a person associated with holiness, such an act seemed especially terrible and unacceptable. She scolded the priest with obvious indignation for his impudence because, being a man of faith, he not only came to her chambers without knocking, but also broke many rules, completely disregarding ethics, and this made his act even more outrageous in her eyes. But instead of repenting, he angrily pointed his finger at her with a cold gleam in his eyes, declaring that she had no right to talk about rules when the beauty herself had broken one of the main ones. She had bitten the guy last time, and now she no longer had the right to reproach him for it. There was no longer a trace of any terrible wound on the boy's finger. It had disappeared as if it had never existed, because the man had healed it with his divine power, as if the fresh air itself around him was filled with extraordinary magic. If you think about it, there was a character in her novel who combined two such opposite roles. He was a priest and at the same time a healer, serving in the church and healing souls and bodies, but always remained a mysterious figure whose real motive remained hidden. The woman's eyes widened in surprise when she heard her name being spoken, and the scream seemed to come from nowhere, causing her heart to beat faster and her mind to freeze in anticipation of what was to come, as if everything around her had stopped, preparing for something greater. The Cardinal, clearly intrigued, asked her with interest how the girl had managed to wound him, since no one had ever been able to even come close to his invulnerability. The man's voice sounded calm, but in his gaze there was a riddle that she could not solve. When the young couple's conversation was interrupted by a strange voice calling the princess by name and approaching them, the atmosphere became tense, as it became clear that if they were found in this position, unsightly rumors would begin that could greatly harm her reputation. In a panic, the princess exclaimed towards Dorothy that she would immediately rise and that they needed to do something urgently to hide or find a way to avoid possible consequences, because the situation was extremely tense and threatening her safety. The man himself, who had not yet realized the full importance of the moment, froze in surprise when he realized that standing in front of him was not just an ordinary girl, but the princess herself, and his entire perception of the situation suddenly changed, because he was sure that he was dating someone completely different. The lady nodded, confirmed her identity, and, containing her excitement, ordered the old priest to leave without wasting time on unnecessary questions and explanations, deciding that further conversations with him would not bring anything useful and would only distract from more important matters. The man, grumbling discontentedly, muttered under his breath that he could not believe that such an impudent and rude person like her could be a noblewoman, much less the stupidest princess, but the facts were inexorable. It was her, despite her strange behavior. The blue sky above the magnificent palace gradually changed its shades. Time inexorably passed, and despite everything that was happening, nothing could stop its progress, as if the whole world was in some long, inevitable expectation of something important and unpredictable. Dorothy followed her mistress, her heart aching with excitement and anxiety, for she felt that something alarming might have happened to the princess while she was away. And this premonition did not leave her for a minute, strengthening her fear more and more. The princess looked closely at her maid and, with curiosity, asked if there was anyone among the priests of their church with unusual silver eyes and hair, because she could not get rid of the thought that this person was familiar. Young Dorothy thought for a moment, concentrating on going over in her mind all the faces she knew, but despite her efforts, she could not think of anyone who could fit this strange description, and the thought of who could be so mysterious haunted her. Jonah walked forward. The woman's thoughts were absorbed by the mystery of the stranger, and she could not find an explanation for his ability to change his appearance. This left her completely perplexed, and his mysterious personality became more and more intrusive and disturbing. The Cardinal, sitting at his desk, irritably covered his ears with his hands, as if trying not to hear his name being called, and in every way avoiding any conversation about it because he absolutely did not want to dive into this endless and annoying topic again. The nun grumbled again at her master for leaving without a word of displeasure, and added that they would now have a formal dinner attended by nobles, which would make it even more important and meaningful. When asked whether the princess would come to the banquet, the nun answered with a confident yes, as if she had not hesitated for a moment. She explained that the princess was from the imperial family, and her participation in such an important event would not only be expected, but also completely natural. The young priest's eyes were attentive. He listened with deep interest, trying to catch every word, because it was important for him to understand what was happening and what decisions would be made in the future, since they could influence many events. Then the stern cardinal, with a slight, almost imperceptible smile, agreed to organize tomorrow's dinner because he had an important and urgent matter. He wanted to talk to the princess about some serious issues that could not be delayed and required attention. The lady's hurried steps echoed in the empty corridor, her dress rustling softly on the floor as she moved forward, absorbed in anxious thoughts, trying to find answers to her inner questions that haunted her, threatening to disturb her peace. The noblewoman walked forward, her face expressing obvious irritation, and inside she was harboring a storm of emotions, because going to the banquet without being able to express her opinion was a difficult test for her, and this situation left a feeling of powerlessness, undermining her confidence. Dorothy reassured her mistress, saying that she was so beautiful that it was impossible to look away, and that everyone at banquets and celebrations would certainly be amazed by her magnificence, because her appearance invariably attracted attention and aroused admiration. The noblewoman thought to herself about how to change public opinion about herself, because she was not at all a stupid girl, as those around her sometimes considered her, and with each day her confidence grew, despite all the stereotypes and criticism that she regularly heard. As soon as young Dorothy raised her finger and said in a slightly didactic tone that she had two candidates who perfectly matched the image of the man her mistress had been looking for so long, she immediately attracted the attention of everyone in the room. The first candidate was the chief priest, and the second was the cardinal himself, both of whom were such mysterious and strange personalities that their presence in this matter seemed not only incredibly appropriate, but also as if they had been chosen in advance for this very important and responsible role. The lady tried to remember everything she knew about the cardinal, who always appeared in his bright red robe, and suddenly realized that this man was also part of her book, a hero she had once invented, and this shook her to the depths of her fragile soul. The lady placed her hands on her temples, trying to recall all she knew about the character, when the maid suddenly said that there were terrible rumors about the nobleman, and his reputation was far from the best in the highest and most influential circles of society. The noblewoman, raising her eyebrows in surprise, listened to the servant's story when she reported that the man was nicknamed the crazy dog from the temple, and this caused her real surprise because such rumors rarely concern people of such high position and influence. The girls, having discussed this among themselves, came to the unanimous opinion that this was indeed a rather strange and even absurd nickname for a man occupying such an important and responsible position under the Pope, and it certainly did not add any dignity to him. After this, the noblewoman insisted that the maid immediately and without delay tell her everything she knew about the cardinal, and that his strange behavior could hide much more than just rumors, since every word could be the key to solving the whole situation. The beautiful weather, not a cloud in the sky, and the majestic palace standing on a hill created ideal conditions for reflecting on the events that took place in these troubled moments, although in the lady's heart there was not so much peace as an anxious expectation of something important. The noblewoman had to walk through a wide hall where a loud noise reigned, creating a feeling of uneasiness and bustle, as if everyone around was absorbed in something important and urgent, and no one paid attention to her steps as she moved forward, as if disappearing among the general bustle. The man who was holding the noblewoman's hand invited her to sit down on one of the chairs, offering her a little rest and to feel more comfortable while they waited for further developments, not knowing what would happen next and what turn the situation would take. The Duke, who was escorting the young beauty, carefully looked after her, not forgetting to hold her by the waist, which added tenderness and courtesy to their interaction, as if he was ready to provide her with everything she desired at this important and, perhaps, fateful moment. After which Bonaparte, bending slightly, turned to his servant and, with slight impatience, asked him whether he knew whether the cardinal had already arrived or not, since their meeting with him was an important part of the planned event, and remained decisive for their further steps. With a heavy sigh, lovely Jonah sat down on a soft chair, thinking how uncontrollable her man connected with her was. If even to an important meeting or banquet he was late, leaving her in confusion and uncertainty, which added to her even more nervousness. Suddenly the young couple, the future beautiful spouses, froze, hearing the cry that the cardinal had finally arrived, and at that moment all attention immediately switched to the entrance, as if this moment could change the course of everything that was happening, creating an extraordinary atmosphere. With a grin, the young man apologized for his lateness, saying that he had simply gotten a little lost in the palace, as if his delay was a minor misunderstanding. But in fact, it seemed rather strange and even ridiculous under such important circumstances. The nun, noticing the delay, immediately began to scold her master, because she had just asked him to come earlier so as not to disrupt the schedule, but despite her persistent requests, he was still late, which clearly caused her irritation and discontent. The princess covered her mouth in shock, realizing that the thief she had encountered was a priest, a revelation that left her shocked as she had not expected such a turn of events, which shook her to the very depths of her soul, leaving her in confusion. The young man froze when he saw the Duke, and their eyes met as if there was tension between them, as if the air became heavy and filled with hidden meaning, and everything around him slowed down at that moment, like in a movie, where every movement and word had its own special meaning. With a twisted grin, the cardinal asked the young nobleman rudely why he was staring at him, as if it was indecent or required an explanation. His gaze was mocking and a little insolent, leaving no chance for further dialogue, forcing him to remain silent. The priest then sternly declared that he did not wish to speak to such trash as he considered the rich duke to be, and his words were full of contempt, as if he perceived the nobleman beneath him as an insignificant person, which only increased the tension. A silence fell among the nobles, cold and tense. Everyone froze, watching what was happening, as if each of them felt that this moment could influence many things, change the course of events and lead to unpredictable consequences in the future. Jonah also froze, listening attentively to the words. Her face expressed complete bewilderment and shock because she did not expect such a turn of events, and her thoughts immediately began to rush about, trying to find an explanation for what was happening before her eyes, feeling herself captive to this strange situation. Bonaparte said irritably that the man apparently remained a boor, incapable of changing, when suddenly his future wife interrupted him, declaring that the cardinal had been a boor and demanding an apology for his behavior, clearly shocked by what had happened. Bonaparte froze in shock, his mouth dropped open and his eyes widened in surprise. He had not expected such an act, because his wife had shown unexpected firmness, defending the honor of their huge house in front of all the guests and decisively pointing out his unworthy behavior. The large banquet table was set with all the treats and there were beautiful chairs around it, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and elegance, but this could not overshadow the tension that was in the air due to the incident that had occurred, and a tense silence was created. The young noblewoman sternly stated that the cardinal had better behave accordingly, since he was a guest in their house, and such actions were absolutely unacceptable within the walls of their hospitable home, which only increased the tension and created an awkward atmosphere. Silence reigned in the hall. Everyone froze in shock, unable to believe what was happening, and even the cardinal himself seemed not to expect that he would be scolded, because usually his behavior went without consequences in the highest circles of society, which came as a surprise. Suddenly, unexpectedly for everyone, the man smiled brightly, as if he had not been scolded at all. His behavior seemed ridiculous and even inappropriate, but he remained steadfast, not showing that what had happened had somehow affected or confused him, which added even more tension to the situation. He bowed politely and said that he sincerely apologized for his rudeness earlier, trying to look calm and confident in his position, although everyone saw how his action violated the harmony of what was happening and caused bewilderment among those present, forcing them to doubt the sincerity of his apology. The noblewoman agreed to accept the apology and expressed her hope that the man would henceforth behave with due respect, which was reflected in her tone when she emphasized the importance of good manners in their home and society to maintain decorum as well as to preserve the family's reputation. The Duke bowed his head and remained silent as he listened to the apologies, his face remaining inscrutable, and he seemed to be looking for something in these words that could restore the former trust in what was happening, but his thoughts remained hidden and vague. It turned out that the rumors about the lady were false, and she was not stupid at all, as some believed. In fact, she had outstanding mental abilities, which more than once helped her out of difficult situations, and her intelligence was at its best, which became obvious to everyone present. The dinner was over, and the pieces of meat were left on the plate, leaving only small remnants that were not eaten, as everyone concentrated on more important and discussed issues, not paying much attention to the food, and everything that was happening seemed much more significant. The prince, noticing the silence and slight displeasure on her face, asked with interest if she liked the food, and she agreed with a slight, almost imperceptible smile, expressing her gratitude and satisfaction, despite all the seriousness of what was happening, which of course could not darken her mood at that moment. The palace youth, who had been closely monitoring the atmosphere, declared that as soon as everything was over, they would immediately move on to the main topic of their meeting, emphasizing that now would be the moment to discuss the most important and troubling issues that needed to be resolved. Soon the entire court retinue left the hall, leaving behind an empty space where a deep silence fell, foreshadowing the beginning of more serious conversations and actions, while the air was filled with tense anticipation of upcoming events, and each of those present felt it. Suddenly the prince, turning to the cardinal with a clear expression of interest, asked him if he had ever remembered anything about the recent events connected with the disappearance of the children, for his curiosity about this matter was becoming more and more noticeable with each passing moment. The guy, who looked like a real handsome guy, turned to her with a light, slightly ironic smile and, sighing a little, replied that, unfortunately, he had no leads or new information that could shed light on the mysterious disappearances of children, which deeply upset him. Then, feeling something changing happening in his soul, the young man instantly realized that in front of him was most likely not a person, but something much more mysterious and threatening, which was probably connected with those strange events that had been troubling him all day. The man, standing in front of everyone, straightened his hand as if trying to emphasize his determination, and began to talk about how they had not ignored any version of what happened and were now going to expand their forces for further investigation. The princess, feeling the tension growing with each passing moment, clenched her hands into fists in front of her. Her face took on a serious expression, and her gaze became focused, as if she was ready to rush into battle, if only to uncover the secret hidden behind this mysterious story. The princess could not remember anything like that happening in the novel she had written herself, and this fact caused anxiety and bewilderment in her soul. She was sure that all the events she had described should have developed according to a certain logical scenario. Under the ceiling, decorated with a majestic chandelier, time seemed to slow down. Each moment stretched out like an eternity, absorbing everyone present in the tense atmosphere of anticipation and the unsolved mystery that hung in the air around. The young nun, in a rage, shouted at the commander that, despite her joy at his arrival, such delays were completely unacceptable and could not be forgiven in this situation, especially considering the importance of their mission and the fact that time had been lost. Dorothy and the lovely princess, feeling that they had nothing more to do there, left the meeting, deciding that their presence was pointless and they could leave without disturbing what was happening, since everything had already been said and all the important decisions had long been made and announced. The priest and the humble nun were quietly talking to each other, discussing the princess, who turned out to be far from what the rumors had portrayed her to be, and in their opinion, she did not at all live up to their expectations and the standards they had expected. Moreover, it was obvious that the beautiful Jonah, without hiding her feelings, in every possible way defended her future husband, the Duke, who, in their opinion, was a real scoundrel, and this could not go unnoticed among those watching and hearing everything. A black-gloved hand moved slowly over the uniform folded in front of the man, lightly touching the fabric as if checking for wear or a detail that needed to be adjusted, creating a sense of endless care and calm concentration. The Duke thought to himself that the Cardinal had turned out to be much more useful than he had previously assumed, because now the sweet Jonah stood on his side, and this gave him confidence in his further actions, opening up new horizons and opportunities that could become decisive in his struggle for power. He then ordered her to prove herself to be truly useful within a month and demonstrate her value to his plan, despite all her uncertainty and strange behavior lately, which left him puzzled and even worried about her true intentions. Silently, the Duke stood in front of himself, deep in thought, thinking about how to properly direct all this in the right direction, not to miss an important moment, and confidently lead the situation in his favor in order to avoid unpredictable consequences that could destroy everything. Standing up, Bonaparte muttered that the month he had given his wife to carry out her feminine task was already drawing to an end, and he felt how time was rapidly slipping away, leaving everything on the brink of the most important decision he had to make. The sky was cloudless, bright blue, and the new day brought with it not only the first rays of the sun, but also an atmosphere of expectation and anticipation, as the palace filled with light, as if inviting the beginning of the most important events that could affect the whole of history. With a light and confident smile, Dorothy announced that the prince had dined with the princess today, which attracted the attention of everyone present, because such moments always attract attention, and their relationship was certainly becoming more and more intriguing and complex. Jonah, shocked by what was happening, muttered how quickly time flies, because very soon the moment of the coronation of the prince and her brother would come, and she could not believe how close this important day had become, full of new trials, challenges, and unknown paths. With delight and pride, the maid declared that the new dress would look simply magnificent on the lady, because it would not only emphasize her refined beauty and elegance, but would also make her unique, as if she had come from the most beautiful canvas imaginable. The girl was looking forward to the moment when her brother would finally become the new emperor, and her heart was filled with pride for him. But at the same time, Deep down in her soul, she was tormented by anxious thoughts about whether her new husband, the Duke, who was ambitious, would kill him at this important moment. The young man stood by the window, his gaze focused on the fist he was clenching in intense thought, wondering how events would unfold next, how difficult it would be to succeed in this world of intrigue, and imagining a future in which everything could change in one decisive moment. Armand stood in silence, feeling his thoughts slowly come together into a single goal, realizing that he was about to become the ruler of the empire, and this moment was both terrifying and majestic, like a transition into an entirely new reality where he would have to make the most important decisions. Bonaparte was a man who had great power and was respected by all the nobles because his decisions always proved to be significant and influential, and his words weighed more than anything else in these circles, where his every action became an example. The young man's hand clenched tightly into a fist, reflecting his inner determination and tension, because he felt the excitement growing, as if every moment was bringing him closer to an important decision that would affect his future and the fate of those around him. There, not far from him, stood the Duke, enthusiastically discussing something with another nobleman. Their conversation looked so serious and important that the young man could not help but pay attention to it, trying to understand what was behind their actions and whose interests they were protecting. Even as a child, the prince often spied on adult aristocrats to learn their secrets and understand how their lives worked, because for him their world was a mystery, full of intrigue and hidden movements, which he dreamed of learning more about in order to prepare for future trials. Then his father, finding himself in a desperate situation, signed all the documents that the Duke had slipped him, and at that moment it became completely obvious that his fate had already been decided, and his actions were the result of pressure from which he could not escape, no matter how hard he tried. Young Armand already realized that Bonaparte wielded considerable power when, eavesdropping behind doors, he overheard conversations full of clever maneuvers and deals, which left him with the feeling that this man was able to control everything that happened around him. And then the young man, with deep determination in his eyes, realized that the moment had come when he needed to grow up, become stronger and take responsibility for his sister, deciding that he would no longer rely on other people's help, but would decide her fate himself, protecting her from all threats. The prince turned away sharply when he was informed that the Duke had requested an audience with him, feeling his heart sink at the prospect of an interview that had always been difficult for him, full of hidden intrigues and careful manipulations that were impossible to escape. The door creaked inexorably, breaking the tense silence. Its sound was so loud that it seemed as if it was a harbinger of something important and decisive that was about to happen at that moment, changing much that surrounded them. Bonaparte entered with a confident step, his figure like the personification of strength and determination, and, bowing to the future emperor, politely handed him the documents, which obviously contained the most important proposals and decisions on which the future fate of the empire depended. The guest room was decorated with luxury, a sofa made of soft fabric, a small table and furniture that created an atmosphere of refined elegance that literally permeated the space, reminding of the high status of the owners of this large house. Having listened attentively, the young prince, with a concentrated look, realized that the preparations for his coronation were complete, and soon he would have to enter a new stage of his life, where everything would depend only on his decisions and further steps. The Duke, without wasting a moment, pulled out the paper and began to read, his face becoming increasingly serious as he announced that his marriage to the boy's sister would soon take place, which would ensure a strategic unification of their houses and give him the opportunity to strengthen his position, expanding his influence in the political arena. Armand, unable to contain his displeasure, frowned and, slightly irritated, asked where they were rushing to, not understanding what could have prompted them to act with such haste, violating all possible diplomatic rules and not taking into account the potential risks to their families. To which Bonaparte smiled slyly, his eyes sparkled, and slightly bowing his head, said that his future wife herself wanted this, striving to legitimize their marriage as soon as possible, because this was not only a personal desire, but also part of a more complex political game.